Hey everyone, welcome back to another video, and in today's video we're going to be starting AP Comparative Government Politics Unit 5. We're going to go through 5.1 all the way up to 5.9 in this series, and we're going to finish up the course. So Unit 5 is my favorite unit of the entire course, and it is a massive improvement from Unit 4. Unit 4 puts me to sleep whenever I have to do anything related to it, and I hope that you enjoy this content as well. It is a lot, though. It's very extensive, and I'm sure you are shivering your timbers a little bit looking at the length of this video, whether this is the 5.1 video or the whole Unit 5 lecture video. But don't worry, I think it's really cool, and all of the content is very applicable. We're pretty much just looking at a bunch of case studies of individual situations in the countries. We're focusing a lot less on the individual political systems of the countries, but we're looking at the people in the country and how the economy, how the politics, and the demographics themselves all influence one another. As always, I would like to share that I do have guided notes for this unit. The link is in the description down below. I also have a multiple choice and FRQ practice tests, and there will be a Unit 5 multiple choice review video eventually. And then there's also a list of key terms that you need to know as well. There's also the course and exam description, which is a document that the College Board makes for every single AP class, whether it's chemistry or comparative government and politics. And in these documents, they outline all of the units, what you need to learn in each unit, and they tell you what skills you need to have in each unit, aka how can you apply this content. That's a big part of any AP course, particularly this one, because not only are you going to have to learn the content, but you're going to have to be able to apply it to real world scenarios, and you're going to do that on both the multiple choice and the free response portion of the exam. All right, let's get started. So globalization is kind of the backbone to this entire unit. So globalization includes economic networks that are growing more interconnected. We don't just see standalone economies in individual countries. We can talk and communicate and interact and trade with other countries around the world. And this has created a worldwide market. And these are pretty much unconstrained by political borders. So you can trade with someone in Europe, someone in Asia can trade with someone in Africa. You could grow a crop in South America and then manufacture it in Asia and then sell it in Europe. There's a lot of integration going around here, and as a result we see state control over their individual economies diminishing. They can still exercise monetary and fiscal policy over internal interest rates per se, and government spending, and that can influence their domestic economies, but there's a lot less leeway in how they work with the international market and in their international relations. It's also deepened cross-national connections among workers, goods, and capital. So it's created a need for guest workers. It's caused many to leave their country in pursuit of educational and employment opportunities. We'll learn this as brain drain. So typically we'll see this in like Japan or Nigeria. If we want to look at our specific countries, people will leave Nigeria to go to, let's say, the United States or the United Kingdom, or other technologically and service-based economies in pursuits of educational opportunities, as well as those in the employment sector. And same thing with goods and services. We see goods being produced in certain countries, manufactured in other countries, and sold to other countries as well. It's created supply and distribution chains that are international. And this overall has boosted economic growth at a whole level. If you're growing something in Africa, you're going to sell that crop to a manufacturer in China. They're going to sell that manufactured product to a service-based entity like a store in North America, and that store is going to sell the crop to you. So all three of those entities are making some sort of profit off of that single good, a single commodity. My phone just went off. And that's going to overall boost the economic growth. All of these GDPs are going to be increasing. But it's also caused economic dependency. If a country is dependent on exporting and trading a certain good or service, and the market value for that good and service goes down, their economy is going to suffer. But if the market price or demand of that good and service goes up and they're making more money, their economy is going to do really well. It's created a more diverse market of goods and services. I like to use agriculture as an example here. We can grow crops in China, and people in Mexico can eat them. And that's a good example. When the Green Revolution occurred in the 20th century, Mexico became a very prominent exporter of corn, and that corn went widespread throughout the world. It is known to have increased Mexico's GDP as exponentially. And it also helped prevent a what's considered to be a worldwide famine. They predicted that before the Green Revolution there would be a worldwide famine, and this contributed to stopping that from occurring. We also see the spread of culture as well through these markets of goods and services. We also have international customers for local businesses. So I can start a business in the United States, and I can have international customers. I can have people traveling here. They could be here for tourists, or they could have moved here. I could also be selling things online. That's a big part of modern-day globalization, is our innovations in communication technologies, particularly the internet. Now, globalization is not always great for local businesses. I do want to emphasize that. We'll look at this some more as we progress through the units. But globalization may cause international businesses, multinational corporations, to develop, and these can hurt local businesses. If I'm let's say I'm a farmer and I am growing corn in Mexico, and I'm selling this corn for 10 pesos. I don't know how much corn goes for in Mexico in the market. And Mexico imports corn from another country, and they sell it for 8 pesos on the market. People are going to buy the imported corn, and that's going to hurt me, a local farmer. So that's just an example for you. It's also caused challenges for regime and cultural stability. With all this culture being exchanged, it's questioned if there's a global culture. It's also changed domestic cultures. So cultures within countries has changed. Like, I remember back in 2020, K-pop was all over the internet. BTS, all over the internet. That became a very fundamental part of international culture, particularly in America and the United Kingdom. I knew a lot of people from the United Kingdom that loved BTS. It's created concerns for domestic industries as they're competing with international corporations that are now prominent at a global level. It's caused economic dependency. It's also caused wealth inequalities. So if certain organizations are taking in all the money, all the profits, that's going to leave certain individuals without those profits, without those incomes. And like I said earlier, it's caused concerns over a homogenous culture as well, as everyone is introduced to the same cultural traits and uses the same cultural traits. I think TikTok's a great example of homogenous culture. What's trending on TikTok is going to be trending in countries around the world. So let's look at our individual countries and see how globalization has affected them. So the United Kingdom is the world's largest net exporter of financial services, and London is a big financial hub. It's because it's home to the London Stock Exchange, which used to be housed in a coffee house. Just so you know, I actually have a short on this if you want to go watch it. And the London Stock Exchange facilitates the trading of global stocks and securities. So it's the world's most international exchange. Big international banks will use London then, because of its financial hub, for large syndicate loans that ultimately go to foreign clients. Anything that's taxed within London is going to be put into the pockets of the United Kingdom government, and that's going to help with increase their government spending. And as we learned in Unit 1, if you increase government spending, you're increasing GDP. So that's something you also got to drill into your head. You may think spending, that's not going to increase GDP. Government spending will increase GDP. London's also a hub for trading currencies and interest rate derivatives. If you have people from around the world buying stocks and securities, they're going to be using different currencies. So if you want to trade, you got to trade your currencies here to invest. And the location also allows traders at the end of the Asian day and the opening of Wall Street to invest and trade. So the time zone is kind of perfect here for these activities to happen. And they also have integration into the global supply chain, which is manufacturing, technology, and automotive sectors for one. I think this is a Nissan. I can't tell what the image is, but there's a lot of big automobile companies being manufactured and the United Kingdom. And this has integrated the United Kingdom into a global supply chain as they receive these parts and then sell the vehicles. All right, so this is more kind of on the London part of the last slide and its role as a financial hub. So this graph shows banks present in the United Kingdom far having higher cross-border exposure. So we're looking at international relations with these banks. I mean, look here at the UK. They're dominating both the liabilities and assets in quarter 1 of 1980 and quarter 2 of 2020, which is a 40-year difference, and they're still at the top. Isn't that miraculous here? All right, let's look at Russia now. So Russia is pretty big in the international arms trade, and I'm not talking about anything about arm wrestles or robotic arms or prosthetics. I'm talking about weapons. They're also a big oil and natural gas exporter. That's like 17% of their GDP. They're also big on coal. That's another one. They're also present in multiple markets due to a variety of goods and services that they sell. They also have big Western cultural influences that are seeping into Russian societies. Harry Potter's a big one. That's kind of big in Russia. And I'm sure some there don't know what to think of it. There's also an emphasis to increase food production and boost incentives for domestic agriculture instead of relying on food imports. And that'll actually help local businesses and local farmers. And there has been economic sanctions placed on Russia by the international community following the annexation of Crimea. So these sanctions were placed kind of as a measure to show Russia that the international community did not agree with their measures in annexing Crimea. So this is a great example of the global influence. So all this community essentially is impacting another part of its community's economy very, very easily, actually. And these sanctions utilize bank restrictions to international financial markets. So they couldn't use, Russian banks cannot use international financial markets. They had to stick domestically. There's also travel bans, so people from Russia weren't able to accessibly travel to other countries to conduct financial means. And there was also currency depreciation, so the value of their currency declined compared to other ones, particularly the U.S. dollar. And let's look at Iran. They also have had sanctions, but these were imposed by the United States and other countries that have limited Iran's access to global markets, just like in Russia. And this has impacted trade and economic development. If you can't trade with certain companies and organizations in other countries, well, your economic development is going to be hindered. Iran is a major oil-producing country, and it's deeply connected to global oil markets. That Middle East region has a ton of oil there. It's a great part of their GDP, but also can cause for commodity dependency, as we discussed earlier. And as I just said, there could be fluctuations in the oil prices. So if the price of oil goes down, Iran's revenue is going to go down as well, and their economic stability is going to go down. So it's going to be more unstable as the oil prices fluctuate. So it goes up and down and up and down. Their economy is going to be very unstable. The country has been seeking foreign capital and expertise and investments in other sectors besides the oil industry. And this is like energy, manufacturing, and technology. And these are efforts to limit their commodity dependence on oil. It's also notable to say that the rise of social media platforms have been integrated into Iran culture. There have been restrictions on them, and there have been times when the government has shut down the internet, but global trends and discussions can be found in Iran. There's also been an increase in tourism, and as of January 11, 2024, there is a do not travel advisory in Iran. But as a whole, tourism has increased in Iran due to a variety of different sites that I have really no idea about because I don't plan to travel there. Let's look at Nigeria. They're a major exporter of oil as well, and their economy is also closely tied to global oil prices and demand. So look at this graph here. We can see this is petroleum consumption. So this is demand. As demand goes up, you're going to be selling more. That's just how it works. Simply the price goes up because more people are going to be willing to pay for more. So we can see here, like let's look at 2018. 2018, 2019, global demand for oil is going up. So Nigeria is probably making a lot of profits, but once 2020 came and COVID shut everything down and people were traveling less and using less gas, the demand went down. Nigeria's economy probably wasn't doing as well, and they were making less profits, and their GDP was going down. It's also very notable to talk about their homogenous culture. As a whole, it's very diverse. There's a lot of different ethnic groups in Nigeria, very, very ethnically diverse. But there have been concerns over the impact of globalization on the smaller minority indigenous cultures, and there being more cultural homogenous character within the country itself, or having more prominent cultures taking hold while the indigenous cultures diminish. And this is particularly due to the English dominance in international businesses. So international businesses taking hold in Nigeria and English being used in interactions and businesses has threatened indigenous language and other practices and markets, for example. So local indigenous markets may be negatively impacted by the emergence and utilization of international businesses and markets. Nigerian agriculture products such as cocoa and rubber are part of global supply chains, and this connects them to international markets. So this kind of welcomes the international markets and international businesses to interact with their countries. There's also been tech startups as well. So this is them integrating into the service industry. And these are examples like Flutterwave, Andela, and Paystack. I've never actually heard of these, but they're actually pretty prominent, and they are real companies and real tech startups. There's also been infrastructure funded by international investors. So these aren't funded by the tax dollars collected domestically. These are funded by international investors, international bodies that are located outside of Nigeria. And the main piece of infrastructure to note is the Lagos Light Rail, which is a railway transportation network. Let's look at Mexico. So there's been economic integration and dependency in Mexico on Canada and the United States, and this is through NAFTA and UMSCA, however you want to say it. NAFTA is no longer in place. That was the North American Free Trade Agreement, and that was curtailed a few years ago. What was put in place in 2020 was the United States-Mexican-Canadian Agreement, and essentially these creates more, not for say open borders and say everyone can travel between the three countries, but more integrated financial systems and trade systems within the countries. There's also been foreign manufacturing plants that are built near the United States and Mexican border. These are called maquiladoras. I hope I said that right. We also have foreign direct investment. I might refer to this as FDI, but these are foreign entities investing in manufacturing, electronics, and automotive industry. So they're relying on these investments. So if these corporations fail, people are going to pull out their investments, and the economy is going to suffer. And BMW is a big automobile one right now in Mexico that's prominent in manufacturing. They also have cities that have become hubs for software development and technology innovation. So this is them expanding into the service industry of the economy as well. But all of these factors have caused for uneven development. The north is more developed and urbanized than the south. So these software developments and tech hubs are going to be located more in the north. Maquiladoras are located in the north because it's closer to the United States. Foreign direct investment is going to be more prominent in the north because investors are going to look at where industry is prosperous, and that's in the north as well. And in these areas, cities are more prominent than in the south. So that's going to make the north way more populous, way more developed, way more urbanized than in the south, which is going to be more rural and less economically developed. There's also been a prominence of e-commerce platforms through the internet, and this has led to businesses reaching a broader market, particularly international. This could be Mexican businesses and non-Mexican businesses as well. Let's look at China. So China is the second largest economy, per se, and they are focused on export-oriented growth. They are the world's factory. Everything that you have, not really, is made in China. It's particularly due to the World Trade Organization allowing it and emphasizing its role in exports. And there's electronics, textiles, and manufacturing that create a global supply chain. And this has led to the expansion of Chinese culture with their prominence. For example, there's been an expansion of Chinese restaurants and celebrity chefs and dishes like dim sum. This is a picture of dim sum. It looks really good. It's like a dumpling, I believe. There's also been Peking opera. I don't know. It's like a form of dance and entertainment in China as well. There's also been rapid urbanization like in Mexico, as well as infrastructure development. And instead of being in the north, it's in the east, closer to the coast, where they can export goods on ships. But there's also been disparities in income and access to healthcare. Healthcare is going to be more prominent where the population is, and that's going to be in the east. So incomes are going to be higher, healthcare is going to be more accessible in the east than in the west, which is more rural and less developed. The Belt and Road Initiative, I just want to include this, has been implemented to enhance trade, economic growth, and cultural exchange as well. And this is a more land-based initiative to expand more in the westward direction to create trade in Afro-Eurasia and economic growth and cultural exchange throughout the entity as well, but also develop more of Western China as well. Like I said earlier, China is the second largest economy. We measure economy size through GDP. This graph shows your GDP growth rate annually in China. So we can see here that the growth rate has remained positive, at least since 2000. It's gone up, though, and then it's gone down. The highest it's reached is a little above 14%, and the lowest is a little above 2% in growth rate. But the kind of stable line we see here is about 8.5%. And in 2020, look at it actually going up and then decreasing. That's kind of interesting to note. All right, we're going to talk about some entities now, starting with the International Monetary Fund. So the International Monetary Fund, its purpose is to be a global monetary corporation. Monetary basically means money, and they are to create a stable money system, a stable international monetary system. So currency isn't just changing every which way every second of the day. It's to promote employment within the country so people can have income and they can have monetary means and financial securities. And it's also to secure financial stability as well within the countries. So facilitate international trade and the use of these currencies and currency exchange for goods and services. So these are some of the big roles of the IMF. There's also to promote sustainable economic growth, which is obviously the main goal behind it all, is to promote economic growth. You don't want another country's economy to decline. As we said earlier, we are in a very, very integrated global market. So let's say if the economy of China declines, that's going to impact the economies of a lot of other countries as well. All right, let's look at the 1994 Mexico peso crisis, because this deals directly with the International Monetary Fund. So there is a fixed exchange rate with the peso and the US dollar. And this, in combination with rising U.S. interest rates, plus inflation, plus a stressed banking system in Mexico, plus eroding investor confidence, it created a peso crisis. The investor confidence is not thankfully, but it is due to inflation and stressed banking and interest rates in the United States that they rely on. And they're like, no, we're not going to invest here. Look at all these terrible conditions we're in. So this created the peso crisis. And the IMF offered a financial package to stabilize the economy and stabilize the peso in the country. And these included policy measures and structural reforms using fiscal policy, which deals with government spending, monetary policy, which deals with interest rates, and structural adjustments as well. And there were goals to increase economic competition, improve governance and spending, because if you increase spending, you'll increase GDP, attract investment as well, bring back those investors that they eroded before, and also control those inflation rates. You don't want inflation rates to fluctuate that much. You want the economy to be relatively stable, so loans are taking out at the same interest rates for extended periods of time. And this ultimately did lead to stability, so it kind of did work. So this is an example of the IMF in action. Now let's talk about the World Trade Organization. So the World Trade Organization is, as in its name, it helps develop the rules of trade and facilitate trade. So it goes smoothly, freely, and efficiently. It'll increase access to easy global trade. So if people put in unnecessary conditions, the World Trade Organization is like, no, you can't do that. Let them trade with you. Don't you want to increase your economy? That's, the big goal. They also want to promote intellectual property protection. They don't want to be like, I never talk like that, but they don't want to go to a country and state that they have to trade. So you can refuse trade or you can demand more, but World Trade Organizations, they always say you don't have to give it up, and another country can't make you give it up as well. Now, it's also important to note that Iran is not a member, so their trading might be a little more unorthodox than in other countries. Here's a graph, a chart, if you want to call it that, of the per capita GDP since joining the World Trade Organization for but 3 countries here. So China, Mexico, and Nigeria. And we can see here that in all 3 of these countries, GDP per capita has grown exponentially in these countries as well. And there are kind of recently new members too. Nigeria and Mexico in 1995, and China in 2001. So we can see here, I mean, look at China, it's grown like 8 times the amount in 16 years. That's magnificent. In Mexico, it's about 2.5 in 22 years. And then in Nigeria, it's about 8 or 9 times the amount in 22 years as well. Nigeria has acquired technical assistance and capacity building programs through the World Trade Organization, and this allows them to participate effectively in trade negotiations to sell and import products, as well as implement trade-related policies such as custom duties and navigate the complexities of international trade, because it's a pretty big and competitive business. Assistance may be provided to Russia in implementing trade facilitation measures, such as the establishment of single window systems to streamline documentation processes, make sure there's transparency, reduce bureaucratic hurdles so the government can't get as involved, and enhance the efficiency of cross-border trade. Because trading in Russia right now is a little more challenging than trading, for say, in Mexico. The government has a bigger role in that, and the World Trade Organization is trying to find ways to make the trade more smooth and decreases this government role and dependency. And let's look at the World Bank. This is our last organization. The World Bank provides technical and financial assistance in order to reduce poverty and support economic development, to raise standards of living. They have been involved in Iran's energy sector. So Iran is a part of the World Bank. They've been supporting Iran's energy sector, and they've been through financial projects related to renewable energy, particularly like green energy, energy efficiency, and infrastructure development, because you need infrastructure development to support the energy. These projects have been related to, in Russia, these projects have been related to transportation, as well as roads and railways, because transportation networks have been desperately needed in Russia, especially in their urban areas. In Nigeria, we've seen the World Bank's support on initiatives to enhance basic education and teacher training and infrastructure in Nigerian schools. So they can get pretty local and personal in their support as well. And in China, we've seen support for Chinese infrastructure similar to that in Iran and Russia. Is building roads, irrigation systems, because agriculture is a big part of China still, and rural electrification, because believe it or not, rural areas in China commonly do not have electricity. So the World Bank has been helping provide electricity to rural areas. Urban areas, though, they have it pretty well. Also, a concept that you need to drain your head, drill, whatever you want to call it. Drill into your head. You need to know this. That's what I mean. It's called economic liberalization. All right? So it's also kind of considered as neoliberalism. We're going to discuss it. So in China and Nigeria, they've acted economic liberalization policies, and a majority of respondents in recent studies have said that they expect children in their countries to be better off than their parents, which means they think that the economy is growing and their children are going to make more incomes, be able to support themselves in an area, in a place, a country with a higher standard of living. So what is neoliberalism? Neoliberalism, economic liberalization, is when you remove government intervention in trade, which is something that the World Bank's trying to do in Russia, and they're trying to eliminate government intervention in trade, investment, not World Bank, World Trade Organization, and other movements of capital. So they're moving it from the public, which is government, to the private, which is the individual sector. So this is essentially a promotion of capitalism. And capitalism, for the most part, makes trade a lot more easier, because you're going to remove tariffs, which are taxes on imports. Nobody wants to pay those, so they're not going to trade with countries with tariffs, as well as utilizing free trade agreements. So, for example, in Mexico and part of neoliberal policies, the number of people in the middle class has grown with this increased standard of living. There's been job creation and skill development with a rising economy. We can measure this, of course, with GDP. GDP, the measure of the economy size. So all of these factors are considered parts of economic liberalization, when the government is taking a smaller role in the economy over the individuals, the producers, and the consumers. Now, there are challenges that come about due to neoliberalism and globalization. They kind of go hand in hand. There's been increased demands placed on governments by civil society groups, particularly for privatization and more consumer role in the economy. So, for example, in the United Kingdom, there was the Extinction Rebellion that has been demanding for more robust government action on climate change and environmental policies. So this is particularly due to globalization, less so of neoliberalism, because globalization has caused environmental change and a lot of environmental consequences. So in the UK, where globalization is very prominent because it's very developed, this Extinction Rebellion occurred to call for action on climate change. There's been protests by students and disenfranchised groups. So, for example, in Nigeria, the End SARS movement was promoted globally to diminish police brutality. There's been the arrest of protesters and the imposition of social media restrictions, particularly in our authoritarian regimes. So, for example, in Iran, an authoritarian regime, they developed the NIN, so the government can control and monitor online activities more closely, monitor what is accessed from other areas across the globe. It's designed to be a more controlled and censored alternative to the global internet. So this is a response to the global internet being used in Iran. They're kind of like, we're going to modify this a little bit. There's also been the empowerment of one's marginal, which means kind of like small, nationalist, populist groups that blame the government for changes in culture and economic conditions. So they blame the government themselves for allowing globalization to get to where it was. So, for example, in Mexico, economic inequality and corruption have fueled the empowerment of populist movements and nationalist sentiments in the country as well. So they're like, yeah, we don't agree with this. So we want the country to be a nation with less corruption and inequalities, which sounds like a normal thing to me. So the 1994 Zapatista uprisings. We're doing a little more history. We're really focusing on 1994, though. So the Zapatista uprising occurred in the southern state of Chiapas in Mexico in response to decades of political, social, and economic marginalization of the indigenous community. So they basically said, you don't think we're important. So we're going to rebel. We're going to want autonomy. We want to have control and not be ignored and not addressed by the national government. It was a pretty interesting event. So the Zapatista group desired land reforms, indigenous rights, political power. They wanted greater autonomy, essentially. They wanted more devolution. And they also critiqued neoliberal policies that caused economic inequalities in Mexico. And the uprising actually occurred on the same day that NAFTA went into effect. And it displayed a resistance to globalization, because globalization and NAFTA go hand in hand, and the local impacts that it would have in hurting domestic businesses and economic development in the South. And it would also increase commodity prices. If you have goods and services being traded from other countries, it might be at an increased price because you got to transport them. And these methods went from military to repression to grassroots participation and gaining international support. So they went through a lot of steps. And inevitably, globalization kind of helped them because they got the international support. It didn't do that much, though. It did stuff, but it didn't do as much as they probably wanted it to. So let's look at Boko Haram, which is in Nigeria. So Islamic culture in the north is very prominent compared to the Christian culture in the south of Nigeria. And a terrorist group emerged in the early 2000s. That's Boko Haram, and they're concentrated in the north, where Islamic's popular. They have aims to establish an Islamic state in Nigeria, and this is created due to the religious tensions there throughout the different religious groups. And globalization has fueled their use of social media and technology and media as a form of propaganda, recruitment, and transfer information to kind of share their perspective and overall influence other people so they agree with it. And globalization has also provided means of financing for them. People have invested in Boko Haram because they have agreed with their cause, or they think they agree with their cause. And they've also used money laundering domestically and abroad using the internet. So they're kind of using the internet for disadvantages to others. And there's been international efforts, not just in Nigeria, but internationally, through joint military operations and diplomatic operations to challenge and respond and inevitably shut down Boko Haram and their terrorism. Let's talk about multinational corporations. This is the last part of topic 5.1. I told you there's a lot. So MNCs, which are multinational corporations, have grown tremendously in a globalized world. They dominate global markets, and they also can pose challenges. So what is an MNC really? An MNC is just a corporation that's present in more than one country, like Coca-Cola, for example. Apple is an MNC. They've caused challenges over labor, where labor is located, how much it costs, the ethics behind labor. So are they hiring a source that uses child labor? Nestle. So there's a lot of ethics regarding that because, for example, in Nestle's case, Nestle didn't go out and directly hire children, but they utilized another organization that uses child labor. There's also the environment and the methods used to create the materials, like getting silicon for technology, or lithium for lithium batteries used in Tesla. Lithium mining is very dangerous and really bad for the environment. There's also land rights over who gets what land and who gets to use different facilities as well. There's also taxation. If you have an international corporation, they're going to be taxed in all these different countries that they're located in. And those can be different at a country-by-country basis, and even a regional-by-regional basis within the country as well. They may not agree with the tax measures, so they may pull out, or they like them so much they're going to become way more prominent than, let's say, they were in another country. And there's also concerns over budgets and how much money they have compared to a local corporation. The MNCs are probably going to have a higher budget because they're more prominent, so they may be able to overtake them and predominate a local community and the businesses. All right, so now we're going to discuss market forces and various ways that the economy is affected. And there's some vocab we're going to have to cover here. So the first one's capital. Capital just means your cash that you have on hand. You may refer to this as liquid assets. Then you have private ownership, and this refers to individuals, so people, consumers, or sometimes producers, or entities like a corporation or a business that holds exclusive rights to assets, businesses, if they own any, or property. And this allows for autonomy, essentially a form of sovereignty over how they use those businesses, how they use those assets, how they utilize that property and obtain and retain profit. So obtain, earn profit, and retain, keep that profit. Then we have public ownership, which refers to the collective ownership, often by a government or public at large, aiming to serve the broader societal goals. So public ownership, in a sense, refers to government-led organizations. So public is if you're on public versus private property. Public property is anything that the government provides, like the sidewalks or the courthouse. That's public property. But private property is typically owned by individuals or businesses. So Walmart is private property. Gas stations are private properties, just for examples. And public ownership is overseen by the government, public entities, and they're regulated by such groups as well. And then basically the opposite of public ownership is private ownership. And privatization is the process where these public companies, these state-owned enterprises, are transferred to private owners, individuals. And this is typically done to increase the efficiency of these enterprises, as well as cut government spending. So they're no longer spending money on the labor and methods to exercise these enterprises. Now, nationalization is the opposite of privatization. You're transferring ownership from a private group of people, a private person, a private organization, to the government, to this public entity. And this is typically done to increase the overall social welfare of the entire country, because the federal government oversees the entire country, as well as to protect national interests and regulate the overall economy of the country. So let's talk about special economic zones. If you took AP Human Geography, you probably have heard of these. If you haven't, well, this is it for you. In China's our only example for this course. Special economic zones are areas that are typically on the eastern region of the country, because that's where the coast is. They're by the ports where exports go. They're designed by the government as specific and special regions that have different economic policies than the rest of the countries. It has its own economic laws. And this is to attract foreign direct investment for the private businesses of China. Now, policies that have allowed special economic zones and the experimentation with these new and regional-based policies began with a bunch of other economic liberalization reforms to attract foreign direct investment in the late 70s. And these clusters on the East Coast are near where those urban agglomerations or megacities are. So our urbanization, which occurs mostly on the east, is going to be where our special economic zones are located. All of those manufactured goods in the factories in the cities are going to be exported at the ports where the special economic zones are. And as I said, this is export oriented. It's convenient for shipping and provides access to container ports and global shipping routes. So this is a map from an old AP Human Geography exam showing where the main clusters of these special economic zones are located. So we can see here definitely on the east coast by where a lot of the cities are. If you look at where Shanghai is up in the top, there's a lot of different special economic zones going on right there. And then the table on the right gives some examples of products that are particularly produced, manufactured, and exported from those cities, and how much it contributes to global production. And this actually does vary by year. So in 2016, 90% of global brand products was produced in, I don't even know how to say that town's name. But you can definitely see how prominent these special economic zones are based on how much this contributes to the production. More about special economic zones. Special economic zones may include low minimum wages for workers, resulting in cost savings for foreign investors. You remember I said you got to attract foreign direct investment. So if I'm looking to invest in a business, I'm going to look in a business that's going to make the most profit, because that's going to make me the most profit. And if you have to pay more for workers, you're not going to make as much profit. So if you have areas that have low minimum wages, that means that you can make more money for profit. You also have reduced tax rates. You're spending less money to the government. You may have tax exemptions to foreign investors. There could be no tariffs, which are known as custom duties. And these are taxes on imported materials and parts that can be re-exported. So if we have these taxes, it's basically reducing tax rates again, then I'm going to be more attracted to investing. Giving foreign firms the right to hire and fire employees, basically giving them more autonomy over their corporations, as well as providing access to China's large labor pool of low-cost labor. So that low minimum wage labor, if I have access to it, I'm going to save money, I'm going to invest. As well as operating without the direct oversight of China's central government. Now, we don't really know for sure how much oversight that really is. My phone is going off. But it can cause production to be more affordable, and it gives a lot of freedom to the foreign investors. And who doesn't like freedom? It also can permit foreign ownership of business enterprises, encourage foreign investors to own and operate businesses in China. Okay, let's move on to Mexico a little bit. We're going to talk about Pemex and the privatization. We already know, based on the term privatization, as we learned earlier, that means we have a public organization, a public enterprise becoming private. So it's no longer in the hands and regulations directly by the government, the federal government. So historically, Pemex had a monopoly over the exploration, production, refining, and distribution of oil and gas. Of course, it's oil and gas, as a state-owned oil company in Mexico. Oil production, however, dropped in the 21st century. So the past 24 years, oil production has dropped. And in an effort to boost efficiency and not ruin the economy and oil production as a whole, they also wanted to attract foreign investments and stimulate, more innovation. The Mexican government decided in 2015 that it was time to private the Pemex enterprise. And this has led to a variety of competition within the economy. If you have the government to no longer compete with, it's going to bring about some innovation here. So you're going to have multiple players now participating in various parts of the industry, multiple oil producers, refiners, distributors, because that monopoly is diminishing. And this has also reduced a dependency on a single entity or good. If you have a monopoly over a good, if that good goes down in value, the economy is going to suffer. However, the privatization has raised recent debates over the balance between economic liberalization, where the government gets less involved in the economy, as well as strategic interests, as well as monopoly concerns over should have Mexico had Pemex in the first place, should it have been privatized decades ago. What about economic inequality? If you have more competitive practices, are they going to be concentrated more in the north and the south? What about long-term planning? Is this really going to help Mexico in the long run? What about sovereignty? Mexico no longer has control over the state oil anymore, as well as environmental sustainability. If the Mexican government has different environmental agendas and beliefs than these private practices, then the one may not get along, and that's not going to help stability. And two, environmental practices are going to differ on an enterprise by enterprise basis here. All right, let's talk about the NNPC. Just more and more abbreviations for you, because I'm not going to spell anything out for you. So the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, the NNPC, NNPC, is a state-owned company. It's public, and it often partners with oil and energy multinational corporations such as Shell Global. You've probably seen Shell on the side of the road or off the interstate or exit 102 by the barbecue place. I don't think that's a Shell there, though. And yeah, these joint ventures contribute to the development of the country's energy sector, of course, because petroleum oil is a form of energy, because it attracts foreign investments, Shell, and promoting the adoption of advanced technologies. The partnerships here that we've discussed, so Shell Global and British Petroleum, will enhance oil production and efficiency, particularly with their investments. They're going to innovate more and bring about new technologies. It's also going to explore new reserves where oil has not been extracted yet. That's a lot of supply there, and improve overall industry performance and lead to economic growth, because money talks. That's the long run goal here. All right, we're going to talk about natural resources a lot. So Russia's government prosecuted a oil business owner, and he had to force his oil company to be sold at auction to an energy company that was mostly public, not entirely, but mostly public, to the Russian government. So it went from private to the public, essentially. And Putin also likes to limit foreign direct investments. Of course, he likes to keep those domestic investors and emphasize right control over Russia's energy reserves. So he's not in favor of private practices regarding natural resources in Russia. And this is kind of different than what we've been seeing in Mexico with their privatization. We're seeing more nationalization. However, let's look at the UK. The UK has a lot of private control over natural resources, actually the most private control out of our 6 core countries. However, China has the least, no surprise. And the trend we're seeing here, the trend that you're supposed to be catching on to, is that the authoritarian regimes have more public control over the natural resources, and our democratic regimes have more private control over the natural resources, or they're transferring to more private methods, for the most part, though. Now we got to talk about government responses to these global forces. With the whole world coming at them, what are they going to do? So they want to improve domestic economic conditions. Get this in your head. People like economic growth. They don't like sitting for 6 hours to wait for lines of bread. They like having competitive markets and competition, because that's going to improve your economic growth. So, for example, of just improving economic growth in Nigeria, they've applied protections to the oil industry to ensure that the countries are experiencing economic growth. You also want to see responses to domestic consumer and producer demand, supply and demand, capitalism. If people want stuff, you're supplying it for accessible prices. So, for example, in Iran, which I haven't discussed yet, has focused on developing its industrial capability, so its manufacturing, particularly in technology, and to reduce reliance on foreign imports, because that's going to cost them money to import. So if they can save the money on the imports and produce their own goods to use within the country and to trade, they can make a lot more money and improve their economy. And if they're making it within their country, they can respond to the supply and demand of their country as well, and what the citizens want related to technology. We could also see control or influence over domestic political debates, not over them, but regarding domestic political debates to maintain or increase their own power. So governments like, should we increase or decrease our power? Should we privatize or nationalize? So, for example, in China, there has been political discourse to manage public perceptions of its trade policies. So people have criticized China over many of its trade policies, both like with special economic zones and economic liberalization, and over how much control that they have. Some say they don't have enough control. Some say that they have way too much control. I mean, as we said earlier, China has the most control out of our 6 countries regarding natural resources. And we also could see a response to extend national influence. Regionally and internationally, basically putting themselves on a pedestal on the international market and into the world. They're stepping up on the stage a little bit. So in the United Kingdom, they're a big global financial hub. They're kind of a big center here economically in London to extend their influence internationally within the financial system. As we said earlier, there's a lot of trading that goes on at the end of the Asian day and the beginning of the North American day of Wall Street. And it's also a big currency exchanger as well. So now we're going to talk some more about globalization and the effects of globalization and some more consequent-like effects of globalization. So a term you need to know is FDI. That's not a word. The words are foreign direct investment, and this term is very important. So it refers to investment to a country, so like Nigeria, by individuals, an individual businessman, an investor, or by a company that is not, its headquarters are not located within that country. So it's like a country from the United Kingdom investing in China. And the reason they do this is to pursue personal interests in the company receiving the investment. So they may be investing money to see that company grow, and they may make a positive return on that investment and financially benefit from it. There's not a lot of specifics you need to know. This is just a term you kind of have to get used to saying and referring to. Foreign direct investment occurs typically between multinational corporations, which are corporations that are present in multiple countries. So it's like in Nigeria and China and United Kingdom and Mexico. If they're present there, it's a multinational corporation. And these can pose challenges to a government's fundamental economic and political ideas and principle, particularly if they have different, like let's say you have investors from the United Kingdom coming into China and investing. They're going to have different ideas about the economy and economic growth and actions compared to those within China. In the UK specifically, we can see foreign ownership of critical infrastructure results in debates over utilities and technology usage from these companies. These are utility and technology companies, and this can raise national security concerns. If you have people from other countries investing in developing technology used in the United Kingdom, they could raise concerns over, hey, is that safe and secure for our country? They have interests in balancing economic openness with a safeguard of national interests, and this does challenge the government's fundamental ideas about sovereignty. So about China. So in China, the presence of foreign companies raises challenge in balancing economic development with maintaining the government's political principles and control over information. So China is very communist. They're very, very protective over the country. They're protective over the economy and the information. So if foreign companies release certain information, they may not agree with the information that is released. In Nigeria, multinational corporations have facilitated corruption and oil dependency, as oil is a big part of that GDP, and it maintains economic growth within the country. So there's also a cultural side to every economy and globalization. And with globalization, we see a lot of diffusion of culture. So this is particularly Western culture. So, your typical pop culture, your TikTok trends, anything that you see probably on YouTube, Amazon, that sort of stuff. It's not really indigenous culture. And this can promote domestic backlash, as within countries, their culture may diminish or be seen as less prominent, or others may judge it or degrade it. This is just an example of, I guess, of Western culture. No, I guess it is an example of Western culture. So, in Iran, for example, their main investors are China and India, and they hope to limit Western foreign direct investment, to limit this cultural exchange that can interfere with their Islamic influence and dominance. In Mexico, the president of the 2018 election partly won due to his campaign to pledge privatization, reducing privatization reforms to Pemex. And if you're confused by reading that, reducing privatization means reducing the amount that Pemex is privated, to maintain that national sovereignty over the organization and limit any outside influence. They want the government to control that organization, the Mexican government. In the UK, with increased trade and investment ties with the United States, there's been a very widespread of American cultural elements, and this is particularly music, movies, fast food. McDonald's is always the best example with fast food as well. But artists like Taylor Swift that are from America, they've spread to the United Kingdom. I mean, her Eras tour recently did a ton of shows out in Europe, particularly in the United Kingdom. In China, economic reforms have led to judicial reforms, and that's pretty much the extent that you have to know about that. All right, let's talk about the environment and health issues. So, increased economic development can cause environmental issues and consequences, and these can accompany health issues that alienate citizens. So, let's say you're building factories, and those factories use coal, and they output various emissions that can cause air pollution that can harm the respiratory systems of animals and including humans. So in Mexico, we see interest group pluralism. We talked about in the last year how pluralism is increasing in Mexico, and this allows many environmental groups to actively promote their platforms and seek changes to national and local environmental policies to limit pollution and environmental consequences within the country. Now, some of this activism has been met with violence from the opposition, and particularly private companies and drug cartels. Private companies particularly are notable because they're going to be the ones that have to follow certain policies put in place. So if they disagree with certain policies because they may make cost of production increase or their profit decrease, they're not going to want to follow them. And then drug cartels, same thing. If they have to spend more money or make less money, they're certainly not going to agree with that. And they're typically more violent than the private companies. In the United Kingdom, interest group pluralism has allowed many, same thing, environmental groups to seek changes to national and local environmental policies. And then in 2015 in China, a documentary, this is a very interesting little case study here, and a documentary called Under the Dome about air and water pollution received 300 million views within 4 days on a government-approved internet in China. So it was made in China and released in China. And after about 4 days, where it see 300 million views, which is still less than 30% of the Chinese population because they have over a billion people, the government of China suppressed and blocked the video. So the people in China couldn't see and be aware of the document's contents and air and water pollution prominence in China. All right, so here's a continuation of those environmental and health issues. So in Nigeria, there have been the rise of environmental groups that have been affiliated with MEND, and most of which deals with oil production and extraction in the Niger River Delta. And they have goals of seeking compensation and environmental reforms due to the environmental consequences of the oil production there, because it hasn't been very pretty. In Russia, we also have environmental activism in the spirit of Russian nationalism kind of coinciding together. And this actually has seen some success to varying degrees in altering government policy regarding the environment. So in 2010, for instance, Russia's government planned construction of a major highway to connect Moscow and St. Petersburg through a large nationally famous forest. And then the activists, they didn't like this because the deforestation would have lost the forest. Yeah. So they protested. They protested the removal of trees by a multinational construction firm. The government did develop an alternative plan in response to these protests, though, to replace parts of the forest that was lost due to deforestation by the construction, which was not originally part of the plan here. So they kind of found a compromise. In Iran, they have some of the world's biggest air polluted cities. There's also prospects of severe water shortages as environmental consequences due to industrialization, particularly. There have been environmental activists, but many have been detained, and one has actually died under suspicious circumstances while they were under government custody. And this one in particular was being accused of using research in an attempt to undermine the regime. So this is a picture of a city in Iran. I'm sure this couple's selfie didn't turn out the way they would hope it would, because it looks like just smog in the city. But this is not a particularly natural phenomenon. Smog is not normal fog. It's a mix of fog and normal air pollutants. It's not a pretty sight. There's a lot of health problems. It can lead to wildlife loss, lower biodiversity. It can lead to lung and respiratory issues in people as well. And it's not visually appealing either. So let's talk about pressures. So foreign governments can bring about certain pressures, such as treaty reversals, public condemning at the international organizations like the United Nations. The United Nations essentially saying, you're doing something wrong, we're going to humiliate you in front of the board of the UN, as well as they can place economic sanctions and limit travel to those countries that offend them and you don't enact certain policies or don't act a certain way, basically don't follow what they want them to follow. Well, we've seen this before in previous slides. And this doesn't have to be just with the environment. This could be with human rights violations. If the government's promoting or not acting upon human rights violations, another country or the organization like the United Nations can place economic sanctions on these countries and basically shame them a little bit. So in Russia, they had economic sanctions placed on them in 2014 by foreign countries protesting the annexation of Crimea from Ukraine. And in Iran, we saw slow growth after facing an economic sanction from the United Nations that intended to stop their uranium enrichment program. And these were later lifted. So in response to global market forces, governments do frequently strive to respond to internal demands for domestic reform. They want to be kind of caught up to date with what's going on within the country and the demands of the people. So the United Kingdom, you could argue that Brexit fits this characteristic, as the rise of the United Kingdom Independence Party took place, and they had a high number of supporters that ultimately led to them leaving the European Union. Governments also work to control domestic policy debates and attempt to extend their influence regionally to deflect criticism and improve economic conditions. Criticized governments typically have lower legitimacy, and then economic conditions, if they're prosperous, will raise legitimacy. So NAFTA in Mexico took efforts to improve economic conditions. In Russia, they've also tried to maintain trade relationships and influence with former Soviet countries back when the Soviet Union was still intact. Look at Putin over there. All right, moving on to 5.4, we're going to talk about economic liberalization, which is a very important concept, as they all are. So economic liberalization is a process that occurs when a state reduces its governmental role in the economy, and it embraces free market mechanisms, capitalism. Essentially, they're taking their hands off the toys of the economy and letting the people work it out a little bit. So this can include eliminating government subsidies and tariffs. Tariffs, again, are taxes on imports. Subsidies, if you don't know, are financial aid that the government provides to support a specific activity, whether that's a business or even a type of farming practice, or it could be an industry that is seen as socially, economically beneficial for that country. They could also privatize government-owned industries. That would really take their hands off the economy. Then we could see them opening the economy to foreign direct investment or promoting ways for foreign direct investment to occur. And this can boost growth and an active global market if you are expanding its foreign influence. In Mexico, for example, we had the approval of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, that enabled free trade amongst North American countries in Mexico. They also joined the World Trade Organization, again, promoting that trade and foreign direct investment. They cut subsidies to farms, and they privatized telecommunications and airline industries. In the UK, under Margaret Thatcher, who was Prime Minister a bit ago, the UK underwent privatization of a variety of state-owned industries. They also deregulated financial markets, and they also just overall had a focus on free market principles. So various measurements can occur. So political economic systems in our course countries, not very measurements, I'm talking about actual measurements here, can be compared through different ways of measuring your economic development, your economic growth, human development, wealth, and equality. We actually talked about this in the very first part of this course, in lesson 1.1. So we can measure the amount of growth in an economy as well as the size of the economy and how developed the country is. So GDP growth rate are two that you're probably a little more familiar with. GDP is your domestic production and government spending. And yeah, GDP growth rate is just how much that grows each year. We see that China here has the highest GDP growth rate. This is 7 years ago. It's still roughly up there. And then this also provides the United States as a reference point. If you don't know what's high, what's low, what's kind of in the middle, what's mediocre, what's superior, that sort of thing. So we can see here that the United States actually does have the highest GDP in the world. China is the second highest GDP at 12. This isn't even $12 billion. This is $12 trillion. for reference here. We also have per capita GDP, which is just GDP divided by the total number of people in the country. You won't have to do any math on the AP exam, but you need to know what this formula is. And the significance to this is China, Mexico, and Nigeria. As you can see here, we can see the change is that China has seen more change in their GDP per capita than Mexico has. Mexico and China are roughly the same GDP per capita. However, Nigeria is still kind of lagging behind. It's seen a lot of change, though, as well. But it's getting there. And then we also have the Gini index, which measures inequalities in wealth. So GDP measures the economy size. GDP growth rate measures the economic development, and Gini index measures the economic inequality. And we can see here that the higher the Gini index, the more inequalities there is. So Mexico, according to this table, had the highest amount of economic inequality, while the UK was the lowest. So what are these goals that governments have when they implement economic liberalization policies? So these are implemented by our course countries of both authoritarian and democratic regimes, and they have various goals of basically improving their economy and possibly curtailing undesirable conditions and circumstances. So they could be trying to limit the unemployment rate going up or reduce economic productivity and output and exports. There could be external situations such as lack of foreign direct investment or tariffs going up in other countries. They could be in trade deficits because of this. There could be a decreasing demand for raw materials like petroleum, natural gas, and rare earth metals. That could be a predominantly strong part of their GDP, and they're going to try to make up for that loss. So in China, they've implemented special economic zones. They're called SEZ, special economic zones. You can abbreviate them. On your FRQs, you could probably get away with abbreviating them as well, because this is a very common abbreviation that you'll see throughout the course. And it's a good chance that you'll be asked about something like this, even if it's just economic liberalization. You can possibly connect it to China's SEZ. So this is a great example of economic liberalization. This is the first one I would think of, is China's special economic zones. So what are special economic zones? Well, special economic zones are regions within China, typically near the eastern coastal area, to bring in foreign direct investment and encourage private entrepreneurship and private businesses and improve the productivity for manufacturing and trade and all that. And it's regional specific laws to increase that economic productivity and prosperity. Neoliberal policies. Neoliberal economic policies remove economic barriers and restrictions on what is considered internal and external economic actors. So the effects of these neoliberal economic policies, basically limiting barriers and restrictions on the economy. The effects of these is a reduction in inflation. So Mexico has passed monetary policy to reduce inflation. We can see increases in the national income. So in Russia, the boom in oil commodity prices have contributed to an increase in national income. We can also see growing inequalities. This is it could be considered a more negative effect in wealth distribution. And in Nigeria, this is prominent due to wealth in the oil sector being concentrated in a few. They're not called anything, but they're pretty wealthy compared to the rest of the country. And the oil reserves are predominantly in the south as well, so that could leave regional inequalities. And as we said earlier, the oil prices, they fluctuate dramatically on the global market, so this impacts the country's revenue very much so, and it can also impact the country's revenue at unequal rates. There could also be persistent political corruption. Again, I'm kind of pointing to Nigeria here, where privatization has been criticized for lack of transparency and accountability in who's actually getting the businesses, or if it's really leaving the hands of the government. And this has led to a lot of allegations of corrupt practices in the sale of state assets. So let's discuss some more about neoliberal economic policies. So the exasperation of existing social tensions. This is a pretty it could be more of another effect of this, of neoliberal economic policies. So governments can balance economic freedom with policies that promote equality. It can also cause environmental pollution. So in China, weak enforcement of environmental regulations and inadequate penalties for noncompliance have allowed some industries, particularly those that have factories and big manufacturing roles in China, to neglect environmental standards. And it's not like China does have some sort of kind of environmental regulations, but they really do not enforce any of it at all. And they're not held accountable for that as well. And even if they do hold someone accountable, they're going to give them a very harsh penalty. Remember that China has a 99.3% conviction rate. So neoliberal economic policies, when you have all this private and unrestricted development, you can have a lot of factories, you can have a lot of extraction and trade, and that involves transportation. And if you don't have regulations on that, then there could be some environmental consequences as well. There's always going to be some kind of a consequence to these actions. In economics, that can be referred to our opportunity cost, which is the highest value alternative that you give up. So you could give up a clean environment of some sorts. You don't need to know about that. It's just something I'm sharing with you. But economic policies can cause urban sprawl, as urban areas are typically where most of these jobs are going to be located, most of the production, most of the trade. The special economic zones in China are particularly in the eastern urban areas. The factories in Mexico, again, the northern urban areas. London is a major urban financial hub. So in Mexico, urbanization has occurred predominantly in the north, and this has led to severe uneven development. The south is very much so lagging behind compared to the north. We can see poor infrastructure be developed. This could possibly be due to the urban sprawl because they can't support the growing population that's exponentially growing. We can see regional migration, again, from Mexico, from rural to urban, which is south to north, and in China, from rural to urban, west to east. The west is very much so more rural. As you get further to Mongolia, the more it's just dispersed, and there's nobody there, and it's hot, and it's desert-like, and it's kind of miserable. I get why people don't want to live there as much. We can also see the increased use of automobiles and other engines using fossil fuels, and this can kind of tie back to the environmental pollution part. So these can cause implications for energy consumption, because obviously fossil fuels are used for energy, air quality from the emissions, and traffic congestion. That's pretty important as well, because traffic congestion can lead to increased amounts of energy consumption and air pollution as well. And that's a big topic that I don't have enough time to get into, that I'm very passionate about. If you want to talk to me about it, send me a DM on Discord. I would love to. They can also impact political parties. We've talked about a lot of political, not political, economic and social and environmental effects, but there is a big, strong political party impact of economic liberalization and neoliberalism. So economic prosperity tied to liberalization policies has affected the power of ruling political parties among our core country political systems. So in China, the Communist Party initiated some neoliberal reforms to attract FDI and basically increase their economy, and this started around the 70s. That's kind of when they started putting in their special economic zones. And the goal was to increase the country's economic strength. However, they do control most of the major industries, and this is a state-managed capitalism sort of system. So it's not full communism, it's not full capitalism, it's state-managed capitalism. In Mexico, neoliberal economic reforms initiated by the dominant party in the 90s, the what was it called? The PRI party, Revolutionary Party. Gosh, is it Industrial Revolutionary Party? I think that's it, something like that. But these were followed by electoral reforms that allowed multi-party competition for governing power by the 2000s. By 2000, in Nigeria, the ruling parties have faced pressure from groups upset with the impact of globalization in both the areas impacted by oil production in the Niger River Delta region and the northern states, which are predominantly Muslim, with larger populations of these Nigerian Muslims that are opposed to the influx of Western culture, and they want to preserve their religious culture compared to a lot of people in the South, which is predominantly Christian. And they also have some resistance to certain aspects of Western culture. I'm sure they're resistant to forms of atheism and sects of Christianity that are not as prominent in Nigeria. In the United Kingdom, the Conservative Party faced pressure from groups of citizens upset with the impact of Brexit. So the Conservative Party, while itself was not the party directly involved with Brexit, that would be the Independence Party. But the Conservative Party over the Labour Party is certainly not as opposed to Brexit, and they face pressure from citizens who were upset at the impact of Brexit, because they were also the party that had a lot of power. So while they weren't directly involved in supportive of Brexit, they were the ones that had the voices, and people went to them because that's who they believed to go to. They had two party leaders, though, that stepped down as prime minister because of their inability to lead the House of Commons to resolve policies related to withdrawing the UK's membership from the EU. They didn't withdraw from the EU until 2020. It took them a few years to get there. They had to find policies that would stabilize their withdrawal and limit any potential consequences, and also get to the official withdrawal process. Okay, so we're going to move on to international and supranational organizations. This is one of my favorite parts of the course. So, an example of an international organization is the International Monetary Fund. That's pretty easy to remember. They both start with international. And then also the World Bank. Both of these exert great influence through preconditions for financial assistance. So they provide some kind of financial aid to countries. They're joined by member states that typically work for a common interest or goal. This is all international organizations. There's some kind of purpose that each organization has, and member states who want to follow through with that purpose/goal will join. So the International Monetary Fund, countries that want to help out with financial assistance or receive financial assistance will join the IMF. And you can also use the IMF as an abbreviation on your FRQs. So international organizations, the member countries are bound by rules and guidelines. They have to follow them or they cannot be members of them. And that can impact their sovereignty negatively. The overall goal of these international organizations, the common goal across all of them, is to build and promote a greater global community, kind of like having neighbors, sort of, and solve various problems. So for just a broad example, countries that receive IMF assistance must agree to structural adjustment programs. And these programs require privatization of state-owned companies, so an economic liberalization policy, reduced tariffs, and reduced government subsidies of domestic industries. So let's go to the pros and cons of joining an international organization. So a pro can include more opportunity for global trade. What about building international relationships as you're interacting with these other countries? You can provide security and stability and earn economic aid and increase your development. Some cons can include free trade promotion that can hurt domestic businesses and industries as these other products are being brought in from other countries. There could be a potential loss of sovereignty as the states have to adhere to organization rules. Many may not treat other member states as equals. They may favor certain ones and dislike others. And because there's so many countries working together, there could be slow and inefficient decision making. So I talked prior about structural adjustment programs in the International Monetary Fund. We're going to go a little bit more in depth about what these programs actually entail. So the IMF manages exchange rates and provides loans to countries in need. Loans meaning the countries have to pay them back. Receiving loans does require agreements to put in and implement and enforce structural adjustment programs, SAP. And I don't think that's an abbreviation you should use on your FRQs. I would write out structural adjustment programs. I haven't actually seen it on the FRQs though. So it could be on there this year. You never know. They can also these programs call for reduced government spending. It calls for privatization of state-owned companies, and this promotes more capitalist/free market practices. And they can also call for the reduction of corruption of government-owned industries. But we saw prior in this lecture that privatization can also have some hands in corruption, depending on who actually is getting the organizations. So these programs also call for the elimination or at least reduction of tariffs that leads to more free trade. There's less taxes and barriers for countries to trade with one another. And also involve reducing government subsidies of domestic industries. And this encourage free trading capitalism as they're not giving it an extra leg. They're not being put on a pedestal. It's survival of the fittest in the economy, supply and demand working out. And this also reduces favoritism of domestic industries. So basically the best ones will survive and prosper. It's kind of like a form of evolution. Reduce government spending, specifically on social services and welfare, such as education and social protection. Let's look at an example in Nigeria in 1986, a little bit ago, but still kind of contemporary. So this was a response to economic challenges, like a decline in the oil prices. Remember, oil is such a big part of their economy that if it goes down, their economy is going to suffer. And they're also accumulating significant external debt. The currency was devalued to boost exports and attract foreign direct investments. They had trade liberalization to reduce trade barriers and tariffs to promote international trade. So these these policies are really hammering in, boosting trade and interaction with other countries through increased export, increasing FDI, and increasing imports to really facilitate real trade. They also privatized or started the privatization of state-owned enterprises to increase efficiency of these enterprises and attract private investment. This could be foreign private investment too, not just domestic. They also implemented policies to reduce government intervention and bureaucratic obstacles in various sectors to make for more quick and easy, efficient decision-making and action. Also, as well, they put in cuts to public spending and subsidies. This is kind of to limit their debt. They put in what's called austerity measures. And they led some economic improvements. But overall, they increased poverty, inequality, and inflation. So not all the time will these structural adjustment programs lead to immediate positive effects. Sometimes it could get worse before it gets better. But these are the major effects that economists have seen after Nigeria implemented these programs. Russia put in structural adjustment programs as well, and this is referred to as shock therapy. So the dissolution of the USSR in 91 left Russia in kind of an economic state that they didn't really want to be in. They were in a turmoil state with hyper inflation, where purchasing power for individuals was decreasing dramatically, and there was a very high need to transition to a more capitalist economy. So they put in a more open and market-driven trade system. They reduced trade barriers, and they also let the prices be determined by the market. And this is, in simple terms, supply and demand in action. They had massive privatization of state-owned enterprises and assets. They reduced government intervention and bureaucracy in the economy to lead to more efficient and less government-involved processes. There were also efforts to stabilize the currency and control the inflation and bring back that purchasing power. They also put in fiscal policies. Fiscal policies deal with government spending, and they also wanted to address budget deficits. And overall, this led to rapid economic transformation like that. An increased FDI and the emergence of the private sector, however, is associated with a rise in poverty for certain groups, inequalities in the economy, and the concentration of wealth, kind of tying back to that inequality. So you could probably predict that their Gini index score was not helped with the structural adjustment programs. So we're going to talk about tariffs a little bit, the pros and cons of tariffs. So again, I've said this before, but a tariff is a tax or a duty that is paid on a particular class of imports or exports. They typically cause for less trade, rather more trade, because that's just less taxes you have to pay if you don't have tariffs in place. So a pro of tariffs, it is a source of government revenue. The government's going to pocket the money. There's also a bolstering of domestic industry as international industry and trade is not promoted. So domestic industry and business is going to be promoted the most because they don't have to pay the tariffs. They're already within the country. They're not being imported or exported. And this can lead to greater employment opportunities and protection of these industries and of jobs. It also can address trade imbalances. So they can limit trade with other countries if it's becoming too heavy, or they can promote it. Cons could be that consumer prices increase if you add in tariffs because international goods may cost more, especially because of that transportation. They could also cause a global supply chain disruption as you have another step in that supply chain. It can be less efficient and take longer or unbalanced. And it can also limit international trade, again, because you don't want to pay those taxes, and grow market distortion. All right, so we talked about international organizations. Now we're going to talk about supranational organizations, and this encompasses a concept known as supranationalism. So supranational organizations, if you're asked to define it, you will say that it's an organization that has national governments as members with its own sovereign powers over member states. So typically we could have like a board or a committee that's kind of the head oversight of these organizations. Not everyone is an equal member. There could be 10 countries on the board or committee that oversee the entire organization, pass policy, address the goals and issues of the supranational organization. Like the United Kingdom and the United States and China, they're chairs on the United Nations, for example. So, with that being said, there are certain pros and cons of a country being in a supranational organization. So, a pro includes cooperation being encouraged between member states, being forced to interact. This could be economic cooperation through open borders or diplomatic cooperation. It could also prevent future conflicts between member states. And it also can lead to one having more influence in the world affairs and pressuring others. And we'll come back to that. They could also give up sovereignty. There's pressure on leaders and political parties within these countries to meet certain demands of the organizations. And not all the policies or the goals or agendas are going to align with what the needs and wants of the country are going to be. The citizens may disagree, and this can ultimately lead to countries leaving organizations like in Brexit, where the United Kingdom left the European Union. So let's look at the World Trade Organization. So for the World Trade Organization, increases international trade between member states. I think that's pretty easy for you to remember. The World Trade Organization promotes trade. Okay, good. It promotes fairness and transparency in trade, so nobody's gypping anyone, and everyone knows what they're getting and what they have to give up. They oversee trade agreements, and they also attempt to make trade easier. They will lower or eliminate these tariff taxes. And import substitution policies. This is pretty important. It's kind of similar to a little branch like our SAPs. So industrialization policies that attempt to support domestic business and reduce foreign dependency are import substitution policies. So they are limiting your imports rather than promoting them to influence and expand domestic production and growth. So they could do this by raising tariffs. If you increase those taxes, those other countries aren't going to want to export their goods to your countries. And if you're getting confused when I'm saying import and export is to give away, import is to obtain. These policies can encourage production of local industrialized products, so goods and services produced in domestic factories. Or it can also encourage purchase of local products by citizens, farmers markets. There you go. So they can be cheaper than foreign products. There's a lack of transportation costs, especially, that will lead to these cheaper costs for goods and services. It can also increase performance and competition of local businesses and industries within the countries. It won't increase foreign competition, but it can increase domestic competition, and this can result into domestic job growth and an increasing employment rate. However, it can lead to less innovation and could produce substandard production as well. And it also may take away sources of government revenue, such as from the custom duties, the taxes that are paid on the tariffs. Yes, the government can tax the businesses as well, but it may not be as much as they can earn from the tariffs. Just examples of, not organizations, but import substitution policy. So that'd be Brexit. So Brexit that really focused on the United Kingdom's domestic conditions, and NAFTA, which really focused on Mexico's production and their exports. So let's do a little in-depth analysis here of the European Union. This is kind of important for you to know. So one of the main goals of the European Union is to open borders for trade of movement and establish an internal market between the European continent and the countries within it. It promotes sustainable development based on balanced economic growth and price stability, as well as having a highly competitive market economy, capitalism, with full employment and social progress. So with that being said, we're going to see a larger market of goods with this open trade across a variety of dozens of countries. So you could have goods and services produced in France and Germany and Denmark and in the Netherlands. They also have a common currency, which is the euro. In the United Kingdom, they use the pound. It also improves trade with lower transaction costs. So that can cause for more trade to occur as the cost to trade is lower. It's kind of like if you have taxes to trade, tariffs, it's going to reduce trade. It also attempts to combat social exclusion between the other countries and discrimination. That's particularly done through these open border policies. They also hope to protect and improve the quality of the environment, and this contributes to European solidarity and European culture and economic system between the whole continent. They're not every country in Europe, like United Kingdom, for example, is part of the EU, but they hope to expand that and unify a lot of Europe through this organization. So there are some pros and cons to supranationalism, as we discussed, and there's some pros and cons specifically to the European Union and the euro specifically. So we're going to look at the euro, which is the common currency. So a pro to the euro is that there are lower transaction costs. Having this common currency is going to lower the transaction costs between goods and services between the countries, because everyone's going to have the same currency. There's no exchange rates to worry about, and currency depreciation between currencies. Yeah. Between foreign currencies. You can have common monetary policy through the European Central Bank, which is part of the European Union, and this will lead to price stability. So you can have common monetary policy because everyone's using the same currency, so everyone can be affected the same way. It can be done in a uniform manner. It can stimulate trade and flourishing foreign investment. It can promote it. And it also is a symbol of European unity because every country is going to have this, and it'll integrate the economies. Now, there are some cons, like obviously having sovereignty issues over currency and economic policy. Sometimes the governments within a country may want to enact a monetary or fiscal economic policies, but it may not coincide well with the currency of the euro. It can also lead to a loss of control over interest rates within the countries, as so many other countries are going to be using and affecting this currency. And it can also devalue the currency as well. Economies, in some cases, may be better off without the euro, and that's what many in the UK suspected during the Brexit era. And this would be due to countries having different economic cycles, having different policies in place, or wanting to put in place. They could have more diverse or less diverse economies with different goods and services that make up a different portion of their GDP. No economy is the same between two countries. It also can just vary because of the market needs and the public opinion, which is just another word for demand. Now, the UK, for the most part, did not fit in the EU. And let's explain why. So it wasn't an original member. It wasn't a founder of the European Union. And the UK, as we see in history, it likes to take charge. It likes to be the one doing all the action and being self-sufficient. And it was never colonized. It was never ruled by another entity for the most part of history. It was the one doing all the ruling. They also didn't adopt the euro during its time in the organization. So they didn't have that unifying feature during their membership. They also opted out from a lot of the borderless travel policies and the common asylum and immigration policies. So they didn't even follow through with the uniform policy making. They also chose not to participate fully in certain initiatives related to criminal justice and law enforcement. So really, what you should be taking away from this is that the EU passed all these measures, and the UK is like, no, we're not going to do that. And it's easy for them to kind of opt out of the borderless travel and common asylum policies because they're an island. They're not even connected to mainland Europe. It also opted out, who would have thought, of the Charter of Fundamental Rights. And they had varying policies regarding issues like working hours and employment rights. And that's a very economic policy that varied between them and the rest of the EU. So there's a lot of criticism that occurred within the United Kingdom of the EU, and I guess vice versa. They viewed the European Union as undemocratic. The European Commission is not directly elected by the citizens of the member states. They're actually elected, the president is actually elected by the European Council. So they could see that, oh, there's no direct elections for these officials. That's not democratic at all. And they wanted, be democratic. They claimed there was a bloated bureaucracy. So, for example, there were multiple institutions, such as the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the European Council, that led to inefficiency and slow decision-making policies and just processes. It also enabled more immigration to the UK, which raised concerns over public services, as well as culture as well. The euro didn't even meet the 5 critical tests that the UK has that would have found it necessary to adopt its use. And the EU as a whole was seen as elitist and uncaring to the UK citizens. It was seen as more of a solution to a more broad and widespread economic goal instead of very specific. And obviously, if you're in the UK, you want your economy to do well. How other economies do, while it is very important that they do well, you don't care how they do that much. So this came about, the Independence Party came about in the 21st century, and it had a big goal that we're going to see here. So the Independence Party was the spark of growing citizen participation in the 21st century. It was anti-European Union. That's very important. It was seen as a fringe party, and it actually clashed with the 2 other major parties, the Labour and Conservative parties. They didn't even like each other. they gained a lot of support across the country. They weren't initially successful, but they had to get there through their platforms, and they started to win some legislative seats in the House of Commons. And their EU focus really grew with this prominence. And they gained a platform that led to a referendum vote, where, remember, the citizens vote on whether the European Union and the UK part ways. And it ultimately led to the UK leaving the EU, as we know. And that process was referred to as Brexit. Brexit! So in 2016, that's when this referendum vote occurred, which occurred years before they actually left the EU. And remember, you know this, a referendum is a direct vote by the electorate on a proposal, law, or political issue. Electorate is just, citizens. And they're not voted on by a representative. So, for the most part, most of the Labour, Conservative, and Liberal Democrats, the major parties in the UK, voted to stay. And the Independence Party voted to leave. And this populist movement led to them having a very, very narrow victory. 51% of the referendum votes voted to leave. However, you can't say, oh, it's so narrow, we should just discard it. No. At 51%, that's majority. They're going to leave the European Union now. The Prime Minister, David Cameron, resigned in disgrace as a result. The successor Prime Minister resigned as well because they couldn't execute a proper and sufficient leave plan. So the UK was in a heavy debate over how to move forward, how to have a sustainable economy, how to actually leave the European Union. And they didn't leave until 4 years later in the beginning of 2020. And this graph itself, there's a lot of flaws to it because the United Kingdom left in the beginning of 2020. Guess what else happened in 2020? There was a global pandemic that negatively affected the world economy. So we can kind of guess how they would recover outside of being in the European Union, but we can't really look at the 2020 statistics and try to isolate Brexit as a cause for any conditions because COVID is also in play here. So we're going to kind of see here that there's been multiple dips in the UK economy, and that's pretty normal. Every country's had some multiple dips here. We can't really isolate any of these variables to Brexit. And that kind of ties back to what we learned in Unit 1, where correlation, yes, the economy did go down after they left the EU, but correlation doesn't mean causation. All right, let's move on from the European Union. We're done talking about that for now. And let's move on to ECOWAS, which is primarily in Western Africa. So what country are we going to talk about? I wonder. So this is the economic community of West African states. Their goal is to build and promote economic integration and cooperation with member states. Again, they just want to boost those economies, make money, make some profits, that sort of thing. Nigeria is the most populous country in West Africa. And they also have the largest economy within the region. They're growing pretty well, actually, compared to the other countries. And its economic strength gives it considerable influence within ECOWAS because people are going to look at them and say, you know what you're doing. Nigeria also has contributed troops and resources for peacekeeping purposes. They have a very strong and active military as well. So we can kind of see a more diplomatic role of the organization as well. Kind of like, I have your back, guys, because we're in this organization. It's a little networking scheme. The country has used its economic resources, such as oil, as a tool for diplomacy and negotiation, and this has influenced regional Western African policies and initiatives. Now, there is not a common currency in West Africa. There has been discussion of a common currency, the ECO, however you want to say it. And that, we'll see how that goes, actually. There's a lot of pros and cons to common currency, as we talked about earlier. And then we're going to move on to social policies. We're making it through. We're over halfway done with the lecture. So social policies promote the welfare and well-being of the citizens. They're dealing with society, social society. And this can impact a variety of aspects, such as the public healthcare provisioning, labor, such as labor policy, minimum wages, housing, and gender-specific policies, such as maternity leave. And social policies as a whole, because they're going to increase the well-being of the citizens, will enhance government legitimacy when they're implemented successfully. And we know that they're implemented successfully when they improve the quality of life for the citizens. And that doesn't mean that their life has to be like that in Wall-E when they're on the space shuttle and they're big fat slobs watching TV all day. I mean, look at this. They're just not doing anything but watching shows. There's other aspects of countries in the society than that. I don't know why I got so in depth with that. I mean, for example, you could put in public green spaces. That's could be a way to enhance the quality of life. Putting in more maternity leave, paid maternity leave, and enforcing that could be considered a way to improve quality of life. Easy, accessible education. So putting in a new school in an area where it's growing in population, that's a social policy. And when you pass a social policy, the government shows that it's addressing changes within the country, and that'll help improve its legitimacy. And it focuses on issues within the country. Typically, these social policies are less international and more domestic. So let's look at some examples within our course countries. We'll start with Iran and their gender equity rules. So since the 90s, many have supported Islamic feminism, which is different from, say, modern-day feminism in the Western Hemisphere. And they promote women's rights in the context of Islamic law, not outside the context, within the context. And they're working within the inner workings of the Islamic Sharia system. So female suffrage, remember suffrage means the right to vote, it was granted actually before the 1979 revolution. And these are some major leaders here. And females can also run as representatives in the majlis. So the legislator is not exclusive to men. However, it is actually, there's no however there, it is notable that the majlis has more women today than it's ever had before. Females can serve as cabinet ministers in the executive. This is a lot more rare than them serving in the majlis, but it is allowed. So we talk about the kind of the political side that females can hold in Iran. Let's talk about the educational opportunities. So there's been a recent trend of more women than men being enrolled in universities. And this isn't just occurring in Iran. This is actually happening across the world. In America, more women are getting degrees and staying in university longer than men. And you can contribute this to men going out and getting jobs, joining the military more, going to trade school. There's also other factors as well, because two-income households is what's considered more financially successful for families. So it's proper for women to have educational experience, to have a career, to pay for families, and just life. I mean, living itself, even if you don't have a family, is hard enough and expensive enough. Starting in 2012, during the presidency of this guy, I'm not going to pronounce that, the government announced a new policy that restricted women from studying certain degrees, particularly these were STEM degrees like chemistry and engineering, at a variety of Iranian universities. Universities have continued to impose these types of gender restrictions to this day on the university studies during the presidency of Hassan something. I got one of them. But women do outnumber men in the university system. So that's kind of important to know. They're restricting women's access to certain degrees. However, there's more women in the university system than men. So it really doesn't make a lot of sense here. Now, outside of the educational world, we have the sports world, and there's restrictions there. So post-revolution, post-1979, the conservative theocracy heavily restricted athletic opportunities for women as both participants and spectators. And around this time, worldwide, women were really making their way into public sports that were being internationally broadcasted across, the world and the country. They're making tons of teams, tons of money. But in Iran, that wasn't really happening. It was still heavily restricted. And I don't know why I put this meme on here. Welcome to the man cave, because, man cave is associated with sports like football. So, yeah. Presidents of Iran, multiple presidents, have expressed support for lifting the ban on female attendance at sporting events. And this is actually something that's very, very contemporary. Not only can they not participate in these sports, but there's been restrictions on their attendance and actually viewing the male sports. And since 2001, there has been desire. I mean, there's always been desires to lift it, but there's been wishes upon the presidents to possibly lift these restrictions. And there have been multiple instances since then where women have been allowed to attend stadiums. However, they are sitting and watching from a separate section from the men. And, I would call this a very interesting concept called segregation. Religious hardliners who control most stadium attendance policies will restrict female attendance inside almost all public arenas to this day. Iranian women have steadily increased their participation in international sports, such as the Olympics. In the 1990s, the president's daughter used her political influence, because, she was the president's daughter, to empower sports organizations to recruit more Iranian women as athletes. And she did this despite the heavy criticism that she received from religious conservatives who viewed as women competing in sports against their religious views. So the reason these restrictions are in place is because many conservative religious individuals believe that women competing and spectating sports violates Islamic law. Iranian women who do compete in athletics, both domestically and internationally, do have some restrictions even then. So they can compete, but they have to dress according to a dress code, which is a very conservative and modest Iranian dress code style. As we go into Mexico and abortion, this is very recent. I'm recording this in 2024. In 2023, the abortion policy changed within Mexico. We're going to discuss that because my old videos, that one's outdated now, where I discussed abortion. So I have to update. So prior to 2023, abortion policies varied per state. There were 2 states in the entire country that allowed for abortions to a certain extent within pregnancies. Not full term, but to a certain period of weeks. In the other 30 states, you couldn't have an abortion. And this is a strong piece of evidence of federalism. Many women were actually persecuted for having abortions during that time. In 2007, Mexico's government decriminalized some of abortions. So this is where those 2 states allowed abortions. Up to 12 weeks of pregnancy. So not the full term. And then in 2023, the Supreme Court actually ruled that prohibiting abortion was deemed unconstitutional. So now abortion, to an extent, is allowed within every state within Mexico. Now let's talk about gender quotas. So political parties began promising to run at least 30% women as candidates in 2003. So this is very contemporary. And prior to 2003, there was not really any promises. Now, this quota, it's not a quota that they had to do, but it was a promise, and it was kind of frowned upon if you didn't do it. And the quota increased to 40% just 6 years later, but parties did fall well below this goal until the IFE mandated the quota rules. So they actually had to do this. This custom that they developed now became mandatory, and the courts actually supported this mandate as well. And in 2014, the Constitution was actually amended, so it's really set in stone now. So there are gender quotas for national and local elections. It's about 30%, I believe. Yeah, 30% of public office nominations are women. It doesn't have to be who actually wins the legislator. The legislator doesn't have to be 30% women, but the nominations need to be 30% women. Okay, let's move on to Nigeria. We're going to talk about educational opportunities again. So women have more access to formal education in the south of Nigeria than in the north. And if you've taken anything away from this course, you should have taken away that the northern Nigeria, kind of sucks. It really kind of sucks compared to southern Nigeria. Southern Nigeria has its problems, like the oil production and all the issues it causes. But the north, it sucks a lot more than the south. There's a stronger cultural emphasis on education in the South, which really emphasizes the provisioning and attendance of education. And NGOs, non-governmental organizations, as we discussed previously, play a crucial role in promoting girls' education. They focus on community-based projects. They also provide scholarships for college. They build schools and conduct awareness programs to change societal attitudes to emphasize a need for an education. And these are most successful in the South. There is a girls' education initiative, an official initiative to improve access to learning, especially for girls where it's more despair. And they've began to shift the life opportunities through education because you can learn how to do more if you're educated in how to do it. All right, let's talk about social welfare policies. Social welfare policies typically apply in, or of course, they apply in all our countries, but the UK's are going to be our big focus for social welfare policies. And you should be kind of familiar with these already. If you don't know exactly what I'm talking about, you will. If you live in the United States, you know so many examples of social welfare policies. So a social welfare policy guides programs that offers public services, as well as financial and other assistance to meet specific needs. So the UK and China both provide government social security pensions to many retired workers and elderly. So teachers in most states, if not all states, receive a pension after a certain period of time for their employment. And this is provided by the government because the government controls public education. People in the military, officers, receive pensions. Again, public funding. Both countries, UK and China, also provide government health care along with housing and subsidies for poor citizens. And they also provide schools. Both have aging populations, which means that their birth rates are declining and the number of elderly people is getting to be a high number compared to the youth. So that means they're going to increase their care for the elderly, typically through increased healthcare processes and funding. And they're going to also see an increase in the number of citizens eligible to receive government social security pensions because there are going to be more people retiring. And there's going to be relatively fewer workers compared to these retirees that will help fund the government program. So eventually there might be not enough money to fund Social Security. They're going to have to cut it to an extent or raise the eligible age. In the UK, politicians who threaten to reduce these plans as a response to their aging populations will face major losses in votes because of how high the elderly population has in influencing the political system. Now, in the UK, they have the National Healthcare Service, the NHS, and this is a publicly funded healthcare system. So they have public healthcare that is free of charge, and the money is obtained mostly through taxation. And it is run and overseen by the federal government. And it has a goal to treat, diagnose, prevent mental and physical illnesses. They offer a variety of healthcare services. So they have pediatrics and adult care and family care, mental health services, hospital services, public health initiatives. They try to have a very broad scope to help all the citizens within the country. Services are free of charge and available to all citizens who pay the taxes because the majority of the funding is derived from UK taxation. So you don't have to go and you don't have to pay for an ambulance trip because your taxes already paid for it. And the services themselves are free of charge. However, you still have to pay for it. Nothing that is provided by the government is technically free. It is coming from some sort of revenue. And for the most part, that is taxation. And the taxation that pays for the NHS is taxation from the individual citizens. It's not like tariffs or something like that. So the citizens themselves are still paying for the program, but it's paid for through their taxes. I think I've reinforced that point enough. Achieving effective integration between health and social care services does remain a challenge because social care services for well-being, such as mental health services and healthcare services, are very different. However, there are integrations between those, and achieving an effective link between them is challenging with this kind of system, without this kind of system. And because of their aging population with an increased elderly number, they have an increased demand for their services because they're getting sick more, they're falling more, they're getting cancer. And this is coupled with capacity constraints. So they may have more people than they can support at a certain hospital or in a certain system, or requesting a certain treatment, so they could be behind in prescriptions. And this has contributed to extensive delays in patient care. I've actually heard of people waiting weeks and months to receive certain treatments. And if you have a very detrimental illness, you may, have it progress to be even worse, or you could die. Now, while the UK has eligibility rules to follow in order to receive social benefits, you have to go through certain steps to receive healthcare or housing. China uses their government to provide services as incentives for citizens to adhere to certain policies. It's kind of like a bribe.
So China has attempted to restrict internal immigration, domestic migration, not from other countries, but just people kind of moving from city to city, and particularly from rural areas to their cities, because their cities are at capacity for the most part. They have a system that rewards many approved city residents with government-provided education, housing subsidies, healthcare. So if you move to the city legally, you move there without any complications, and you are an approved city resident, you will receive all these government benefits. Now, you are not restricted from moving to these cities. However, you are restricted from these benefits because you didn't follow the proper procedures. You didn't take their bribe, essentially. And the internal immigrants who move without approval of the system will forfeit all the provided services. And when China restricted families from having more than one child, which is called the one-child policy, some regional enforcers prohibited an unimproved second child in a family from government schools and healthcare. So, again, the one-child policy wasn't like, oh, we're going to kill you and your family if you have more than one children. It was just them not providing government services like healthcare, which is kind of needed to survive, and schooling, which is kind of needed to learn how to do a lot of stuff. So yeah, these are strong incentives to have just one child in the country. In Iran, oil revenue is connected to government services and pays for operation costs. So that's going to lead to lower taxes of the citizens because they're obtaining revenue from somewhere else to pay for their government services. Healthcare is provided by a combination of public and private services as well as NGOs, which is part of the civil society. So the citizens also kind of take part in this. It's very interconnected. The government does subsidize some housing for poor residents, such as in UK and China, but public housing efforts are very, very, very slowed down by the economic struggles of Iran related to lower oil prices. So if the oil economy is doing terrible, public housing is going to be in a terrible state. And as well as economic sanctions enforced by these governments. So when there was a sanction enforced on Iran to stop their uranium enrichment, public housing slowed down. Iran's government also sponsors para-government charities called bonyads, I don't know. And these are mostly funded by oil revenues instead of taxes. And they're run by elite families in Iran. And that's caused some debates over corruption within the country, over how these charities function and who gets their provisioning. The purpose of these bonyads is to direct the oil profits into financial benefits for the poor, but they are suspected of delivering too little financial benefit for those intended causes, while they are run by the wealthy Iranian families. So they might be taking a little dollar or two into their own pockets. You never know. So here's a graph for you, in case you didn't see it. How does oil production or success of the oil market impact Iran's provisioning of services? Well, as we discussed, if the oil market sucks, their provisioning of services is going to suck. So we can conclude or predict that from 2010 to 2015, their public housing provisionings went down. But from 2015 to 2018, it went up. Or other services went up, such as their role in the healthcare system. All right, so let's move on to industrialization. This is a pretty interesting topic and one that you can probably relate to a degree. So industrialization is an increase in industry and manufacturing within an economy, so you see factories essentially, where industry is more dominant than agriculture. So it's more dominant in its GDP. More people are going to be employed with it. You see a ton of factories being sprung up and used. So we can see here industrial production compared to June 2007, and we have China, the European Union as a whole, US, and Japan. What I want you to take away from this graph here is that China's industrial production has been increasing very, very dramatically. So from 2007 to 2013, it increased 96%, which is a lot. While in the EU as a whole, which UK was a part of during this time, the US and Japan, it actually had negative increase. It declined. And then something I want you to take away from this picture on the right here is that industrialization with these factories, they emit a lot of air pollutants, and this can cause for air pollution and respiratory issue problems and a lot of other environmental and health effects that we'll get into. So China, because of its 96% increase in industrialization, they create a quarter of the fossil fueled generated carbon. The United States is in second place, but China is up there with 26% of it. So one would say that industrialization grows a dependency on fossil fuel usage, and I would agree on this as well. So industrialization can cause environmental damage. Let's look into this a little bit, because there may be some misconceptions that you have here. So in China, industrial discharges and inadequate wastewater treatment have led to water pollution in various rivers and lakes. So contamination by heavy metals and chemicals used within these factories has negatively affected the water quality, as well as negatively affected aquatic ecosystems. This has led to the death of various organisms, plants and animals. When you discharge these chemicals, that can affect the pH of the waters, and certain animals and plants have different zones of tolerance. So if that pH increases and they can't handle it, they're going to die. Same thing if the pH decreases and the water becomes more acidic, those organisms are going to die. In Russia, the extraction of natural resources, industrial waste, and potential oil spills, because they have a strong oil economy, poses risks to the delicate Arctic environment. In Iran, major cities face air quality issues because of the factory emissions. In the UK, sites contaminated with heavy metals and other pollutants have seen required remediation efforts to lower those pollution quantities. In Mexico, the Santiago River has faced contamination from industrial effluents, such as chemicals, and this impacts the water quality and the ecosystem, similar to China. In Nigeria, they've seen rapid urbanization because their population is increasing exponentially, and they see industrial growth exponentially growing as well. And this has led to increased air pollution in these cities where manufacturing occurs. When industrialization occurs, typically you see urbanization occurs, because in these urban cities, that's where the factories are going to be located. And since people want to be located to where the jobs are, they're going to rapidly move to these urban cities. So now what? Governments can choose to respond or to not respond to environmental damage. We're looking at both. So why would they not respond? Well, they could be ignorant to the long-term repercussions. I mean, what's the worst that we can have? What's the worst that we can have happen? Okay, so what? We discharge a few chemicals into the water. That's not going to do anything. They could be an authoritarian state, prioritizing benefits to political leaders. It's all about them over the citizens and societies. They could prioritize economic success and profits. If they manufacture more, they can sell more, make more profits. They could also have a lot of corruption within major industrial businesses, and this can occur through lobbying and bribes. Now, the governments can actually respond to them and respond to environmental damage, such as it being too severe to ignore. I mean, look at this picture. Would you want to live there? I mean, look, they shut down schools because the smog has been linked to hundreds of deaths because of the terrible air quality in Iran. Healthcare needed by affected citizens is too costly, so they may say, "Oh, we need to reduce these healthcare costs. Let's change our environmental effects." What is the word? Let's remediate our efforts. Remediate was the word I was looking for. There could be lobbying and citizen protests bringing these issues to their attention. It could be politically advantageous to support environmentalism, so they could get platforms and votes if they say and enforce certain environmental standpoints, because the citizens may promote and believe in them as well. They could also have pressure from the international community. They could see certain supranational organizations like the UN place sanctions on them and negatively affect their economy if they don't address certain environmental issues. So let's talk about Mexican acid. So in the state of Sonora, the Buena Vista de Cobre, I believe that's how you pronounce it, it's a copper mine, owned by the Grupo Mexico, has been a focal point of environmental protests. It's a copper mine. So there's copper, it's a metal. In 2014, a massive spill of sulfuric acid contaminated some rivers. And this affected thousands of residents who rely on the rivers, as well as agricultural lands, so the food couldn't grow. So there was a decreased crop yield. It also affected the ecosystems as well. And this incident sparked widespread outrage and protests against the mining company and government authorities for inadequate regulation and oversight, because they saw it as their fault for not preventing it, which makes sense to a degree. All right, let's talk about Nigeria, oil, and action. Math here. Not really. The government, in collaboration with international partners and oil companies operating in the region, has initiated various cleanup and remediation, there's the word, projects to address environmental damage caused by oil spills. Oil spills can be Very bad. I mean, just the example that comes to mind is birds, and they get oil in their feathers. They can't fly. And when they can't fly, they die. So a cleanup project was launched in 2006 by the HYPREP. And this is aimed to remediate contaminated sites and restore the ecosystems in Ogoniland. And this is an area that is very heavily impacted by oil pollution and oil spills. The government has taken steps to provide healthcare services and support to affected populations, establishing medical facilities, clinics, and outreach programs in the Niger Delta region where oil extraction is prominent. They diagnose and treat health conditions that are related to oil contamination, such as respiratory problems, skin diseases, as oil sticks to the skin, as well as reproductive health issues. So there's a broad scope that oil has when they negatively affect humans. Additionally, the governments have partnered with NGOs and international agencies to deliver healthcare services, health education, and medical supplies to affected communities. So they're taking action. Let's talk about pollution in the UK, because they're not perfect either. So poor air quality, particularly in urban areas where manufacturing occurs, has been a long-standing concern since the Industrial Revolution in the 1700s. And this has been linked to air pollution that's linked to health problems such as respiratory diseases and cardiovascular conditions. So the molecule that I have here is ozone, O3. 3 oxygen molecules makes ozone. And that's an pollutant that is emitted. We actually have an ozone layer in the atmosphere that helps prevent the sun from just vaporizing the earth, essentially. And there's more to it. That's just the very, very bare minimum of it. Take AP Environmental Science if you want to learn more. Environmental groups and public health advocates have called for stricter regulations and measures to address air pollution. So there's been addressing this. The citizens are addressing this issue. The government has implemented measures as a response to these citizens addressing the issues, such as the clean air zones in cities, restrictions on emissions from vehicles through emissions like the ultra-low emission zone in London, and regulations to phase out the sale of petrol and diesel vehicles by 2030. And these actions all aim to reduce air pollution, that's their common goal, and protect the public health. So here we can see nitrogen dioxide background concentration. So it's kind of low in the majority of the UK in its surface area. However, it does have concentrations in its cities in England. And the background concentration is gotten a lot higher, actually. So this is for PM 2.0. So this is particulate matter, which is another pollutant as well. And we can see here that it's also very prominent, not just in London, but outside London as well. So it can spread throughout the entire country.
All right, so now discussing China and peer pressure, because even the Chinese government can fall into peer pressure. So as China seeks to maintain their economic growth, remember they have the second highest GDP in the world, and they also want to maintain economic competitiveness in the global market and maintain their role as an export-oriented country. There has been pressure from international trade partners and investors who bring in FDI to address environmental concerns that have resulted from their production. Consumers and businesses in importing countries have become very much so more conscious of environmental and social responsibility issues, particularly within the last 30 to 50 years. And this is thanks to the development of transportation and particularly communication technologies. Government-implemented green finance initiatives have been implemented to support investments in renewable energy, clean technologies, and environmentally friendly projects. China has encouraged industries, and by encourage I mean they say they promote it, but it doesn't really get enforced. And they quote-unquote encourage to adopt cleaner production methods, reduce pollution, and they comply with environmental standards to enhance market access and competitiveness in global supply chains. Essentially, they're saying they're enforcing it and working on solving the environmental issues just so their investors will continue to invest with them. Regulatory agencies such as the Ministry of Ecology and Environment conduct inspections, impose fines for non-compliance, and enforce penalties for violations of environmental laws. Companies found to be violating such regulations may face sanctions, closure, or suspension of production licenses. So, in theory, this regulation could work into capping environmental output and effects of individual organizations. All right, let's move on to Russia. So Russia's been embracing environmental initiatives such as renewable energy development that can attract investment and stimulate economic growth, of course. Russia's vast renewable energy potential, particularly in areas such as wind and hydropower, which is where most of the investments in development and research are going into, have presented opportunities for investment and innovation. Participation in such programs like the Green Climate Fund or the bilateral partnerships with other countries have provided financial support for these projects. They're the funding for these renewable energy projects and have led to infrastructure and other building efforts. Because, wind energy needs like wind turbines, and that costs money. You need people to pay for that. Russia is a member of the International Renewable Energy Agency, the RENA, and collaborates with other member states to promote renewable energy deployment and technology transfer. And this is just someone named Irina. I think she's an actress. Iran, the water. This is actually a picture of Chinese water torture. I thought it'd be a fun little addition here to the slideshow. So, Iran has faced pressure from neighboring countries and international organizations like the UN over their environmental sustainability, particularly shared water resources regarding rivers and waterways that cross national borders. Concerns about water scarcity, how much water they actually have, over extraction, and upstream dam construction have led to tensions and disputes with neighboring countries like Turkey and Iraq, who also have water sustainability issues that they're trying to address, or they have connections to these water bodies that Iran also has. It has also led to pressures from international organizations like the UN. The government, as a result, has implemented various water conservation measures and strategies, such as construction of dams for water storage, investment in water-efficient irrigation techniques, as well as public awareness campaigns to promote water conservation and sustainable water usage practices, such as for agricultural irrigation or water consumption from an individual basis. And if you look up top, that's Lewis from Suits, and he kind of looks like a beaver, and the resemblance is uncanny. I also thought I would include that as well, just for fun. All right, let's talk about some more responses to industrialization, which is really what we've been talking about for like the last 10 minutes probably. So other responses can include physically moving factories, implementing green technologies with subsidies, which means the governments are promoting and funding and giving money to these industries for them to comply, as well as engaging in infrastructure development that promotes renewable energy, such as wind turbines, as well as environmental regulation with enforcement, such as fines or loss of licenses. The UK has been a global leader for the development of offshore wind farms, projects such as the Hornsea, I don't know. It's a wind farm off the Yorkshire coast. Yorkshire coast, and the Beatrice Wind Farm in the Moray Firth. These are examples of investments in renewable energy infrastructure. So this is a picture from one of those projects. I believe this is the one off the Yorkshire coast. Physically moving factories and implementing such technologies, that's growing in China. Passing laws that require nationwide conservation to hybrid and battery-powered automobiles can address air pollution problems in the major cities where they're really prominent because all the cars are concentrated, and that leads to traffic as well as the concentration of these air pollutants that cars emit. There's also the factories. The industry emit pollutants as well into the air from their production. So if you limit these methods, these processes that are used in factories and automobiles, you can limit the amount of pollution. So in Mexico, cities have introduced such measures such as restrictions on vehicle usage during high pollution periods. In Nigeria, they've created a working environmental regulatory agency. In China, they've banned certain types of solid waste such as plastics and unsorted paper. And that's very recent. It actually started in 2017. Other responses include developing infrastructure and other mechanisms to respond to health crises related to systemic pollution. So they can improve efficiency of road, rail, and other ports, and that can reduce the dependency and usage of fossil fuels, and look for ways to incorporate green energy within infrastructure environments. The UK has been investing particularly in sustainable transportation infrastructure, and they've nationalized certain rail industries.
And these efforts have been made to decrease air pollution in urban areas. Some cities in Mexico have been focusing on creating green spaces to absorb pollutants and improve overall city quality. So this is a picture on the right here taken from Mexico City. So this is a green space that's been recently developed to promote environmental sustainability and reduce air pollution and other effects of industrialization. All right, let's talk about austerity measures. Austerity. So governments concerned with budget deficits, which means they're spending more than they're making, can result from world market fluctuations, and they usually adapt austerity measures to overcome these deficits, which results in funding cuts to state programs. So they're trying to cut government spending so they spend less than what they make. You want to either break even, or in reality, you really want to be in a budget surplus where you're making more than you spend. Can anyone guess what the United States is in? Cough, deficit. So this can include budget cuts to programs such as education or tax increases. So you can actually just make more money and spend the same amount. So in the UK, there's been significant cuts to public housing, welfare payments, quangos, and other social services. And this has been very controversial, and the political party that's pushing these is the Conservative Party, and individuals who disagree with this do not identify themselves with the Conservative Party. And cuts to public housing have been linked to unemployment and homelessness. Welfare payments have been linked to decreased access to food and other necessary resources. In Mexico, all public servants, including scientists at federally funded labs, are required to get the president's approval for paid trips abroad. So, since they are public servants, they have to get public approval, essentially, to take trips abroad that are considered part of their service, which means they have to be paid for by the government. So the government's trying to cut spending on these trips by having to approve all of these measures. This is actually very recent. I just looked up austerity measures in Mexico, and this was one of them, and I thought it was kind of interesting. And this is meant to address inefficiencies in the system as well, and also weed out anyone who's studying abroad or researching abroad for measures and causes that aren't really beneficial or purposeful. It's very highly controversial. So what are the pros and cons to austerity measures? So a pro can be it helps government regain control over their finances because they're reducing reliance on borrowing, which is called fiscal discipline. They're spending less money, which is good. It contributes to long-term fiscal and monetary sustainability. It ensures that governments can provide their required services without accumulating debt, which can negatively affect the economy of the entire country and the people within it. It can also control inflation pressures by reducing aggregate demand. That's not really a concept you have to know, but it's just a little fact you should just stick it in your mind a little bit. And if you reduce inflation, purchasing power of the citizens will increase. Now, what are the cons? The cons include economic contraction and a short-term GDP decline. In the long term, this is supposed to actually help the economy, but in the short term, it could actually lead to a smaller economy size, which is called economic contraction. It can also lead to unemployment and social and political unrest via dissenting opinions. It can also cause deflation, which can lead to further economic contraction and the reduction of investment. All right, let's talk about more economic liberalization. And we're talking about this topic a lot. So what does that mean? It means College Board really loves it. And you can probably expect to see it on your AP exam. So trade liberalization affects the growth of domestic and foreign businesses. So the amount of direct foreign investment, your FDI, foreign exchange rates, population movement, and the quality of environment are affected by trade liberalization. Reducing tariffs, reducing these import taxes may lower consumer costs for certain goods and services, because let's say I'm growing a crop and I'm importing it, that can actually come in at a lower price than if I was buying it locally produced. And this comes at the expense of those local domestic industries. Increasing tariffs may protect domestic industry and provide jobs and profits to local businesses against foreign imports, but it is at the expense of higher consumer prices most of the time. So what if we cut tariffs through liberalization? How would that affect FDI? Well, if we cut those taxes, imports are probably going to increase because those importers are not going to have, they're going to have less barriers into bringing their goods and services into a country. Now, what about currency demand?
Well, if you have increased trade, you're going to have increased demand for the currency. Now, there's a lot of factors impacting that. It's not something you really have to focus on for this course, but if you increase currency flow and exchange, it's going to increase the demand for the better, more valuable currency. Okay, so we're going to move on to demographic change, a lot more social changes and characteristics within countries. We're going to look at migration, we're going to look at birth rates, death rates, and that sort of thing. So we're going to look at causes of changes in demographics, the population within a country. So we can see obviously falling and rising birth and death rates. We can see war, immigration, changing cultural values regarding families. Some religions promote having larger families, while some cultural groups support having smaller families or no children at all. There can be changing domestic and abroad job opportunities, so people are going to leave the countries to pursue jobs or university education. And this is influenced particularly by urbanization. People can move within a country from rural to urban areas since jobs are clustered in urban areas. And particularly when people are living in urban areas where cost of living and crime rates are higher, they're going to have less children. Government policies and employment opportunities can draw workers to different geographic regions within the countries, which can influence positive or negative migration rates. Population growth will vary within the country. Economic development will vary within the country. So let's look at China. So there's been a shifting emphasis within the past 100 years in China from agriculture to manufacturing. Fewer government restrictions and regulations on the economy through economic liberalization has led to migration from rural to urban areas, and the urban areas are concentrated in the coastal areas on the east side. So it's going from the west to east. And this has created a growing population whose rising incomes allow them to pursue work and educational opportunities abroad. So this increased employment and steady employment too, because industry, you're just producing goods 24/7. In agriculture, the seasons can vary. There can be different crop yield, which can result in different profits. There's a lot more factors and confounding variables in agriculture than manufacturing. And it's also created massive cities through these industries that contribute to a growing population within the cities that serve as hubs for job and economic opportunities. Don't get this confused with China as a growing population state. It's not growing in population anymore. So when the industry first developed, yeah, it did grow in population, but it's not doing that anymore. The cities, however, are still predominantly growing in population, while the rural areas are really lagging behind. Service and infrastructure is way more prosperous in the cities than in the interior, because that's where the demand is for these services and infrastructure, such as roads. Creation of special economic zones enhances coastal migration because there's varying economic laws. This draws multinational corporations to set up factories, which increases employment. It also increases foreign direct investment. Key term. So this is a city in China. I don't know which one it is, but look how developed it is. Look at all the lights. There's green spaces. There's rivers, which means there's probably ports and factories for exports. It's very developed. And look at this graph here. We can see that on the interior of China, 6% of the population lives there in the western side of China. But on the eastern side, 94% of the population live there. All right, so we're going to go over a migration system that China has within the country. So this system restricts where citizens can live. It's supposed to help control population distribution and overcrowding in urban centers. Basically, you have to ask for permission to move within the country. Every Chinese citizen is registered as either a rural or urban resident based on their place of birth or their family's current registration status. And this designation will determine their access to various social services and entitlements through public provisioning. Statuses are historically tied to their birthplace, which makes it difficult for rural residents to permanently relocate to urban areas because they're seen in the system as a rural resident and their families always lived in rural areas. So why should they change? Citizens are issued a booklet or a residence permit, which serves as a proof of their registered status. And if you follow these registration procedures correctly, you are entitled to certain public provisioning, such as education, healthcare, and housing. If you move within China essentially illegally, you will not be granted access to education, healthcare, and housing.
Urban holders typically have access to better social services like education and job opportunities compared to their rural counterparts because the demand is greater and the provisioning is greater in urban areas. Those who don't follow the system will not receive any programs in direct relief from the government. All right, let's talk about brain drain. I briefly touched on this earlier, but we're going to go into it a little bit more in depth. So, brain drain involves highly skilled or well-educated individuals, your big brains, leaving their home countries, such as in Iran and China, to escape either government policies or practices that are perceived as limiting, corrupting, or repressive. So, they may see that the current state of government or their country is not promotive of their education or their career. So, they're going to leave the country to pursue better economic and living opportunities. So in Iran, highly educated members feel threatened by the conservative theocratic state and do not want to risk incarceration, or even worse, such as their accidental death. Many see the government as undemocratic because it isn't democratic, it's authoritarian. They see it as hostile, and they have a lot of frustration to many of the clear, corrupt government officials. Many leave due to government opposition of women, homosexuality, ethnic minorities, and religious minorities. In Nigeria, we're seeing greater members of society seek more and better economic opportunities abroad that are just more prosperous than those within Nigeria. The conditions aren't as great to promote their sustainable and well-off careers and experience. Some fear also the potential of military rule to return. They've only been democratizing for a short period of time, and there's still instability within the countries. Religious and ethnic minorities, there's a lot of them, may feel oppressed or denied certain economic opportunities for employment, or they may not be able to receive the same educational opportunities. They may fear violence or terrorism by the Islamic Boko Haram terrorist organization. So this graph shows regions for brain drain within Nigeria, and most of the time it's just to find better work or higher paying work. But there's also a high amount seeking economic hardship. Very few of them are actually just traveling to experience other cultures and travel the world. There's real legitimate economic reasons for why they're leaving Nigeria to more developed countries. The US and the UK are very high destinations for brain drain. Countries that see a lot of brain drain that outside of this course, Japan's coming to mind. Japan and India are two big ones that come to mind. What about changes within Mexico regarding their demographics? Well, we talked about NAFTA before. It's a form of economic liberalization that lifted tariffs within North American member nations. Mexico, Canada, and the United States. Close enough. They've removed agriculture subsidies that have hurt dependent farm workers who relied on these subsidies for funding, and it's encouraged migration out of these agriculture areas. There's too much foreign competition and financial instability. Maquiladora zones are manufacturing plants, particularly in the northern regions of Mexico, with the parent company's administration facility in the U.S. They're a high source of foreign direct investment from the Americans from multinational corporations. It allows companies to capitalize on the less expensive labor force in Mexico. In the United States, it's more expensive for labor, and they also receive some benefits in doing business in the United States. The people who are in Mexico, the Mexican maquiladora zones, receive the benefits, not the companies. Foreign direct investment patterns prompted migration from rural to urban areas, which is from the south to the north. In Mexico and China, it's west to the east, but in Mexico, it's south to the north where major industrialization occurs. It's contributed to economic disparities with more development in the north with a higher standard of living. The south is kind of lagging behind. The government will also support this growth in the north as well. That's very evident. It's also very close to the U.S., which brings about financial opportunities such as for trade or labor. So why exactly are they moving from the south to the north? We kind of know why, but we kind of don't know why. So why are they moving? So there's a poor economy in the South. There's lack of job opportunities and persecution. So in one state, there's high levels of violence linked to drug cartels and criminal organizations. People don't like to live in areas like that.
There's authoritarianism within the federal governments, not the federal governments, the regional governments within the South and the political officials within them. There's lack of educational opportunities. So for one, the Chiapas has one of the lowest literacy rates in Mexico. It's a state, and they have very limited access to education, particularly in rural indigenous communities. So here we see where internal migration is occurring the most, and the highest amount is those dark blue colors. We can see here in the north, internal migration is occurring a lot more frequently. Like little penguins waddling in herds. All right, let's talk about migration within the UK. They're seeing a positive net migration of immigrants, which means that they're seeing more immigration coming into the country than emigration leaving the countries. And this has resulted in social and political tensions. So the UK Independence Party supports more restrictions on immigration and reductions of government benefits for new immigrants. They see immigrants as negatively affecting government services that are provided to the public, as well as just British culture as a whole, like they're beans on toast. It's also notable that the UKIP performs poorly in House of Commons elections, but this is highly tied to their very controversial Brexit campaign. Immigration results in immigrants desiring jobs because they need to earn a living within the country they're moving to. So it's education, peace, stability, democracy, civil society, protection of their civil liberties, social welfare programs provided by the country, and multiculturalism in urban centers. 14.4% of people living within the United Kingdom were actually born overseas. So here I have a lot of different statistics for you. You don't have to memorize any of these. If you take a college class and you have to memorize like the population of the United Kingdom every single year for like 30 years straight, drop the class. It's so useless. You can know the trend of when they increase or decrease, but you don't need to know the specific numbers. So the trend we see here is that the population of people in the UK who's over 16 and are married is dropping. And this is significant because that means they're going to have less children. Their total fertility rate is going to decrease. We see that there's less people in the English region of the UK that are born in that country. In Scotland, and Scotland particularly, there's a lot more residents there who were born within the United Kingdom. 25% of the UK has no religious affiliation. That's definitely the result of immigration because the UK is predominantly Christian. You remember the Church of England in history class? And most of the residents who are immigrating to the UK are actually from India and Poland and Pakistan. They're not from neighboring countries like Ireland, France, Germany, and the Netherlands. Poland's kind of close, but it's still on, I would consider, the eastern side of Europe. India is in Asia, for one. That could be due to the close ties that India and UK have, because India used to be a colony of the UK, just like Nigeria. So what are the effects of these migration? What is going to happen because of shifting migration patterns, not just to the demographics, but also to the political aspects of the countries? Well, we can see increased crime from the higher population density. We can also see highly skilled workers residing in the same area, competing for the same jobs, but they may also be absent from other areas, so certain jobs may be vacant, or innovation may occur less and less. We can see an increased use of existing infrastructure and housing. We can see housing that's just not available. What's the word for that? Scarcity. Wow, I forgot the word scarcity. There could also be demands for new and expanding infrastructure and housing, such as road lane increases. There could be the development of new political parties that stand against immigration, and support from supranational organizations that challenge government's legitimacy. So here we see a housing deficit within Nigeria, not the UK, that has grown 300%. So this is the housing deficit right now in Nigeria. Nigeria's population, especially in the urban areas, is increasing exponentially, and their housing deficit just keeps on growing. It's crazy. So this is the cultural landscape of Lagos, the capital of Nigeria, in case you didn't know that. Look how dense it is, and look how, for one, there's multi-story housing. It's all close together. So there's definitely demand for a lot of new housing here. So what about population control? Can we limit the population growth to help with this housing crisis? Or if the population is aging, can we bring some babies into existence? Well, there are ways that states can resolve different demographic pressures. So an aging population, which is due to a high doubling time, a low natural increase rate, and low total fertility rate, may encourage immigration in larger families. Now, I just went through a lot of jargon that you may not understand. Let's go through this step by step. So a high doubling time. Doubling time is a measurement in time in years of how long it takes for the country to double in population. So if you have a very, very high birth rate and the population increase just keeps going up and it's increasing a ton, it's going to double pretty quickly. So it's going to have a low doubling time. However, an aging population where population growth is minimal, their doubling time is going to be really high. Natural increase rate. Natural increase rate is exactly what you think it is, just the increase in population within the country. So if it's low, there's low population increase. Total fertility rate. That's the average number of children a mother is expected to bear, or on average within a country. So in an aging population, they're going to have less children, less babies being born, which means the total fertility rate is going to be lower. So in states with aging populations, how are they going to respond to that? Well, they're going to encourage immigration to bring in more people, as well as larger families. They're going to try to increase that total fertility rate. So, for example, they can enforce a federally mandated paid maternity leave period to promote mothers to have more children and say, hey, you can do this. We got your back. So this is particularly happening in UK and China because they're aging populations. Now, in countries where the increasing population is just so rapid and needs to be controlled, we're going to see a low doubling time, a high natural increase rate, as well as a high total fertility rate. And states may respond by discouraging immigration, as well as discouraging larger families, and emphasizing birth control and contraception. So they could limit the number of annual work visas that are provisioned. Religious minorities also impact demographics within a country. Some governments may encourage discrimination, while others are more tolerant, and authoritarianism particularly fuels discrimination. All right, let's talk about Mexico. They're shifting gears a little bit. So the average number of children per woman, the total fertility rate, has decreased from around 7, which was in the 1960s, to 2 in recent years. So in just about 60 years, the number of children that women are expected to have in Mexico has dropped by 5, which is a ton. The growth of the manufacturing sector, particularly in the north, has created employment opportunities and attracted migrant workers from other parts of the country. And these migrant workers are having less children. They're particularly women as well, because women don't typically work in agriculture. Urban areas have better access to education, healthcare, employment. And this leads to, of course, higher standard of living, higher HDI scores, but also lower fertility rates. You're not going to have time to raise a family if you're working a job or you're getting an education in college. In rural areas where these opportunities are not present, people are going to be having children more. Now, it's notable that 80% of the population within Mexico lives in these cities. Mexico has experienced an increase in immigration from Central American countries that are southern to the country, but they're coming to the north. And this is increased particularly because these other countries see violence, poverty, and political instability. We're going to continue on with Mexico. So there's programs that provide cash transfers, healthcare services, and educational support to families living in poverty. It's showing that the government's not leaving them behind. They're trying to alleviate the economic pressures that have been associated with recent industry and economic development and population changes. These programs are called Prospera. Mexico City, with how clustered it is, has faced issues with its proximities of populations, such as traffic congestion, air pollution, and inadequate housing. There's not enough housing for everyone. There is scarcity. I remembered it this time. The Seguro Popular program provides access to essential healthcare services for uninsured and low-income individuals. Migrant Protection Protocols, MPP, provide temporary shelter and support to migrants while their immigration cases are processed. And they can live in a cardboard box while they're waiting, I guess. I just thought it'd be funny. Alright, Nigeria is experiencing a high crude birth rate. What does that mean? That means that their birth rate's high, which means they're seeing a lot of population increase. So children are a sign of prosperity and are high valued within Nigerian culture. Both of the dominant religions within Nigeria, Christianity and Islam, promote having large families. And I love this gif here. I saw it on Instagram one time, and this mother just apparently threw her baby through the drive-thru window, and I don't think I showed it in this gif, but she received a milkshake in return. Children are used for household labor within Nigeria, and agriculture, subsistence agriculture as it's called, is very prominent in rural areas, and that's where the people grow crops, not for commercial purposes, but to live off of them. And this provides economic security as well. There's higher infant mortality rates. More babies are dying and are not reaching age of sexual maturity in adulthood. And this means that if you have more children, more will survive to adulthood. And that's always the goal here. There's also limited access to family planning and contraceptive services. So if you have limited access to, let's say, condoms, that form of birth control, it's going to lead to more unplanned pregnancies. There's an increased demand for infrastructure because of this increased population in areas such as housing, transportation to move all the people, water supply, people need water to live, and sanitation, because having a lot of people in the same area can lead to a lot of germs. And because of these demands, we can see congestion, inadequate housing, and strained public services. Look at all those vans just in the same little market area. The youth unemployment rate is over 30%, and underemployment is even higher within the country. And this has contributed to social unrest because people don't like that. There's increased crime rates, particularly in the urban areas where the underemployment rate is high. Nigeria faces food insecurity due to the population growth. Not enough food to go around, not enough accessible and cheaper food because people have to also pay for their food. And that's why subsistence agriculture is prominent in the rural areas. There's limited arable land, though, in the urban areas, and there's very low agriculture productivity as a result. Malnutrition rates are high, particularly among children. There's overcrowding in hospitals and clinics, which is due to shortages in medical personnel and supplies, as well as lack of spacing. There's inadequate healthcare infrastructure. These are throughout the urban areas within the country. In rural areas, housing and hospitals may not even exist. It's about Iran. It's a darn roller coaster. We're going up and down and up and down, and you'll see why. So in the 80s, Iran encouraged larger families because of nationalism, religious duties to have children, and replenishing the population that was lost during the revolution. And this actually led to population growth. In the 90s and early 2000s, they started to promote smaller families because the growth was so much. Larger ones were beginning to be denied government services. The government even provided free vasectomies. However, there was a fear of rebellion due to the strain on providing public services to the growing population. Today, which is not too far from the 90s and early 2000s, there's an increased encouragement for larger families to speed up the crude birth rate as well as population growth because it's declined what they think is too much. So the government offers cash payments to families within the countries upon the birth of a child. This is an incentive they have, and they have larger payments for additional children. So the more children you have, the more money you get. These payments are intended to help the cover of basic costs of raising children and to incentivize larger families. Mothers are entitled to paid maternity leave for a specific period of time, and fathers may be eligible for paid paternity leave as well. Religious leaders in Iran, including clerics and scholars, may even issue religious edicts, I don't even know, they're called fatwas, and they encourage fertility and childbearing as well. And these endorsements will carry very significant weight in Iranian society. They have a lot of status, and they may influence couples' decisions about how big their family should be. And the goal is to increase the family size. Iran has invested in expanding social services to support larger families, such as access to healthcare, particularly family planning healthcare that will, OBGYN healthcare and pediatric healthcare, as well as education because children need education and other childcare services. All right, let's see how Russia needs to be saved. So Russia is comparatively in the same boat as Iran. They have a declining crude birth rates. They are seeing urbanization, however, recurring in the country, and that's resulting in their crude birth rate declining. their urban population has increased from 74% in 1990 to 81% in 2020. Which is an increase. It may not be as big of an increase in, let's say, Nigeria, but it's still an increase nevertheless. Now, urbanization, as we discussed, is often associated with lower fertility rates due to the higher standard of living, the higher costs of living as a result, limited space because people are going to live in apartments and not multi-acre housing, which we don't really have in America anymore, and career-focused lifestyles. They don't care about children as much anymore. They may be delaying marriage and childbearing to focus on their education and their careers. In 1990, the average age at first marriage for women was around 22 years old, and in 2020, it raised to 26 years old. That biological clock is ticking. There's a higher cost of raising children, particularly in urban areas where the standard of living is higher. The availability and acceptance of contraception and abortion within the country has increased, and this has promoted the normalization of smaller family sizes and the use of family planning services. Now, in Russia, mothers are entitled to maternity leave for up to 140 days before childbirth. That's roughly 4.5 months. And they're also entitled to it up to 70 days after childbirth, which is a little over 2 months, with additional unpaid leave available upon request. So there's pros and cons to it. Time off work to spend with your child, that's pretty important, but not getting paid, that's kind of a downside to it. So it's a pro and con depending on a person-by-person basis. It varies from other countries that we've discussed that have mandatory paid maternity leave. Fathers are also entitled, though, to maternity leave, and it can be for up to a 14-day period. Introduced in 2007, the Maternal Capital Program aimed to incentivize larger families, providing financial support to mothers upon the birth of a second or subsequent child. Now, why is it the second child? Well, it's the second child because that is the replacement rate. The replacement rate is 2 children per mother, and you are replacing the oldest generation, essentially. So if you have 2 children, you are contributing to the replacement rate. And if everyone in the country has 2 children, then you can replace the current population. Mothers receive a lump sum payment upon the birth of their second child, and they can use this to improving family living conditions, education expenses, or even mortgage payments. The program was even expanded to allow more funds to be used for the education of the child. While the program has shown some success in increasing fertility rates, its long-term impact has been pretty much limited. Critics argue that the one-time payment is a one-time payment. It's like you're getting one check from the government, and you can blow it off at once, or you can save it. It varies from family to family. And some argue that it may not be sufficient enough to offset financial costs associated with raising children for 18 plus years, the long run. You may spend all the money in the first year or so. That's not going to help you later on, especially because they're not getting an education the first year. So here is a news headline. It's Putin urges women to have 8 or more children. That's a pretty extreme number. And as you can see, this is very recent because we're looking at the Ukraine war, which I haven't really discussed in this course because it's not part of the course. So you can kind of see that the government, United Russia, because we're going to assume Putin stands for what United Russia believes, supports having very large families. And Putin even says that women having large families is a goal of theirs for the coming decades. So what we can assume from this is that Putin not only wants to replace the current population, make sure they're at the replacement rate, but they also wants to increase the population exponentially. All right, China, you're getting old. It's like that one song the kid sang to his principal, Mr. Wells. That's where this headline came from. So there was a one-child policy, you've probably heard of it. It was put in place in 1979 for urban families and the ethnic majority, not ethnic minorities. It was enforced through a system of incentives and penalties, kind of like their internal migration system, which includes fines, employment restrictions, and a denial of social services for those who violate the policy. Local government officials were the ones who were responsible for enforcing this one-child policy, and they did this through household registration checks and family planning inspections. So they're really getting to your personal drama and business with this. It led to a crude birth rate decline within the country, so it was pretty effective at bringing down the birth rate, and it put less strain on the public services and the distribution of necessary resources, such as food and housing. It led to families prioritizing males, though, because they wanted them to have jobs and support themselves. China is a very collectivist culture. They believe strong in family values and a core united family, and they believe, for the most part, that children should support the elderly parents when they can no longer work. So this made them prioritize male births because they knew they would have an easier and probably more successful time building up a career and being financially stable. They weren't relying on anyone else, such as a woman relying on a husband to support the family. So this led to a gender imbalance, also known as a skewed sex ratio, where the population of China is majority men. And it's not relatively split. It's not like 51-49. It's a pretty significant distortion. It's not like 80-20, though. And during that time, abortion and infanticide, I really butchered that, were rampant. In 2015, this one-child policy wasn't reversed, but it was up to a two-child policy. So you wouldn't face any fines for having two children. And this is because society in China was where late marriages were prominent. People were having little to no kids. And the government hoped to tackle some of these issues. Families in China can now have as many children as they like, though, because they realize they just got to get rid of this altogether. And anyone can have 12 children in China, like cheaper by the dozen, and they will not face any fines or other consequences. Now, the UK is also getting old. They're seeing a lot of open-heart surgeries. They have a declining crude birth rate, but immigration has helped replenish the needs for the workers lost by the declining crude birth rate, and it's limited economic unproductivity. Now, UK has a very high life expectancy. People are living long, which means they have the time to get various health complications like heart disease, and this puts stress and strain on the NHS. Old people fall more often, too, so they have to get more hips. My AP biology teacher was once talking about a significant turning point in an elderly person's life is when they break their hip, because that's when all the doctor's visits exponentially increase and the cost of healthcare just go up dramatically. The life expectancy in the UK for both men and women is above the global average. It's 79 years for men, 83 years for women. Waiting times for elective surgeries, A&E visits, and access to mental health services have been a concern amongst this aging population. The NHS is struggling to meet targets and standards. Workforce shortages, funding constraints, and rising healthcare costs further strain on the capacity and the effectiveness of the NHS. It's costing them more to provide services and the quantity of demanded services. The system needs more money to pay for their services, which creates challenges in the government. Should they raise taxes? Should they cut costs elsewhere? It's a highly debated issue within the country. So we're going to look at population pyramids. This is something that you need to kind of get familiar with reading. Now, thankfully, there's only 6 countries you kind of have to recognize. So we're going to go through all 6 of them, just for fun. So a population pyramid shows the population at an age cohort, so age group. So we can see the percentage of the population that is male between ages of 30 to 34. So in Iran, it's 5.3% of the population. 0.5% of the population is male ages 75 to 79, but 0.6% of the population is female ages 75 to 79. So we can actually conclude from this population pyramid that the life expectancy for women is higher than that in men. Not by much, not by like 10 years or so, but it's definitely higher, probably from a year or two. We can see that the Islamic countries saw a good crude birth rate increase from ages 70 to ages about 30. So about a 40-year period with a crude birth rate increase. And then they saw about a 15-20-year period with a crude birth rate decrease. And then it's slowly increasing back again. Here in Mexico, I don't know why, but I see this and I think of an onion, and that's just me. But we can see that their crude birth rate is relatively increasing. They're seeing not an aging population at all. In Nigeria, however, this is Nigeria, they are seeing exponential population increase, actually.
Where over 16, almost 17% of the population is below the age of 5, which is kind of crazy. However, almost none of the population is living till the age of 70, which is remarkable. All right, take a guess at what country this is. Think about to the demographics that we talked about for all 6 of our course countries and try to identify. It's not one of the 3 we've already done, but try to take a guess. And if you guess China, you are correct. So one thing I looked at here is that there's a skewed sex ratio. Look at ages 15 to 19. 3.1% males, 2.6% females. That's kind of crazy. So yeah, and it's also an aging population. We can see here that there's not really any birth rate increasing. Most of the trend is that it's decreasing. All right, test out this country and see if you get it right. So we can see here that the life expectancy, there's a lot of people living to the age of 80 and 85, and people living to 90 to 99. So this is actually going to be the United Kingdom, because this has a really high life expectancy. We can determine that from the population pyramid. There's not really a skewed sex ratio, and there's not really any birth rates that are increasing. It's probably an aging population. Alright, we have one left, so you probably can take a gander what it is, but it is Russia. The Russian Federation has a population of 145 million, which is like half of what it is in the United States. Actually, it's way less than half, actually. Because we have over like 50 million people. So that's a lot. We can see here that there's considerably, you could argue, a skewed sex ratio as well. In Russia, favoring women, which is a very interesting phenomenon. So something else to take into account. So there's these little tidbits here that we just discussed about each of the population pyramids that can help you recognize them on the AP exam. And read them. You have to be able to read them as well. But we can see here that the crude birth rate in Russia is decreasing, at least in the past 30 years. So they may soon be considered an aging population. And that's probably why Putin wants 8 or more children per family, as that news article said. Alright, we're going to talk about resources now. This is the final part of the course, is just natural resources. We can go through this, alright? So resources are nationalized in varying degrees in China, Iran, Mexico, Nigeria, and Russia to do what? To provide government revenue, to consolidate government control. Remember, national means that it's within public control, which means the government controls it. In Mexico, efforts have been made to allow private investment in Pemex oil, to decrease government control on energy policies. And this is the decisions of one of Mexico's largest companies. They also can reduce political influence of foreign governments and multinational corporations by having this government control. In Nigeria, multinational corporations that pay for oil rents to the government have significant political influence. All of these can enforce political legitimacy if they utilize and provision the resources efficiently and sustainably. Let's talk about the oligarchs. That's literally a name for a group of people within Russia. So in Russia, they have privatized many of the Soviet Union's industries related to natural resources. And this has resulted in a massive concentration of the wealth in a group of business owners known as the oligarchs. And these are the 10 most wealthy oligarchs within the country. The first one is actually named Vladimir, which is kind of interesting. But they are the primary business owners of these privatized industries. Some oligarchs have challenged Putin, though, for power, and they were criminally prosecuted because Putin didn't like that, or at least they were threatened with prosecution, or they were exiled, like this is Romeo and Juliet. After the criminal conviction of Russia's wealthiest business owner, the government forced his oil company to be sold at an auction to an energy company, mostly owned by the Russian government. So you could say that they're taking a step back from this privatization in favor of nationalization. That's him actually on the right. This was one method that Russia's government has used to renationalize some businesses and to get back control of the central government. So this is why Russia's not democratizing. It's still very authoritarian. So what's the pros and cons to nationalizing a business, an industry, such as an oil company? Well, the pros is it can provide government revenue. It can provide political legitimacy if they use the company correctly and efficiently, and they boost the economy of the country. It also can reduce the political influence of multinational corporations and foreign governments. However, the cons can include it does increase government control. It can lead to corruption between the handlers of the industry. And it can lead to no competition because nobody can compete with the government. And wealth is concentrated among government officials. If it was privatized, it could be concentrated among business personnel. But if it's nationalized, government officials. So what are the pros and cons to privatization? Essentially, just flip-flopped. So pros is decreased government control. We see enhanced innovation in industry, particularly due to increased competition. Market prices for consumers. So this means that the prices for certain goods, like natural resources, are determined by supply and demand. We see increased capital for resource exploration. Cons include wealth inequality, which is shown through the Russian oligarchs. We can see a loss of sovereignty as the states are giving up those resources in the industries. Bribes and kickbacks to government officials, though, to secure contracts or conduct various policy-making measures. Yeah, like on The Simpsons. Bribery, it can be rampant. All right, let's talk about rentier states. Rentier states. I've never covered this before, so I have no idea how to pronounce it. So, rentier states obtain a sizable percentage of their government revenue from the export of oil and gas or from leasing the resource to foreign countries. So, they're basically dependent on oil and gas for their economy and their government revenue, which makes up a part of their GDP because government spending is a portion of GDP. So, rentier states are able to raise standards of living and fund government programs based on their huge reserves. So, basically, if the oil market's doing well and they're leasing the resources to a lot of countries, they're going to raise their standards of living. Leasing the resources to these foreign countries, or they can do it to multinational corporations, it's done because of the expertise that these other parties have revolving extraction and production and distribution that may not be available domestically. It also can generate wealth, but it can also generate corruption. Because what doesn't generate corruption? And in our course, Iran, Nigeria, and Russia are our rentier states. So what's the pros and cons to being one of these states? Well, the pros is it provides easy money through exporting a very desirable resources. People like oil. It's used for so much of production. You can use for your cars. It's used for so much. It's cheap fuel for domestic business and energy. If you're just extracting the oil domestically, those local businesses can obtain it very cheaply, and they can use it for energy and business. It can allow governments to have monetary resources, to provide resources to the individual states and cities, the individual cities within their countries, and provide infrastructure and education and other services within the within the country that are public. However, the cons is that it can lead to a singular focused economy that isn't diversified. It's very focused on a single good or service. It can lead to major pollution that's involved in the physical extraction and distribution and manufacturing of these natural resources. And this is particularly air and water pollution. And if you want me to explain the meme on the right, so the ring that they can afford is benzene, which is a pollutant that is produced through, I believe, automobiles. It often leads to major corruption, of course, between government leaders and multinational corporations. They might get a kickback or two, or they can embezzle some funds. Let's talk about the resource curse. So a lack of economic diversification leads to an increased dependency on a certain good. They are cursed to rely on a certain resource. The concentration of government resources on developing the one profitable export, because they're going to want to invest in this, can exclude other industries. They may not get any funding. They may not prosper. This can lead to severe revenue fluctuations if the world market prices increase, decrease, kind of like a roller coaster. So they may make less money one year where oil reserves are down in the economy. Or if they're doing really well financially, they're going to make a ton of money. And this could vary year by year, month by month, day by day. It's like the stock market. They can lead to the overvaluation of the currency, but also trade imbalances. It can also lead to wealth disparities, and it can lead to a lack of incentive to modernize the economy. This is a pretty traditional way to make money. And they may not lead to them cooperating with international judicial bodies and multinational corporations that don't deal with these resources. It can also lead to corruption in the absence of democracy, aka authoritarianism. And Gordon Ramsay is shaking his head to the right over there. And it can lead to a lack of government accountability because they're not going to be relying on their citizens for taxes as much. Tax rates in Iran are extremely low compared to other countries because they're making so much money off these natural resources, and they don't have to hold, the citizens don't have to hold them accountable because it's not their taxes that are being used for most of the services. So we can see here, it's kind of like a heart monitor. That's why I put that GIF there. The crude oil prices vary dramatically. So the economies will do well when they increase, but if they decrease substantially like it did in 2008, 2009, their economies are going to suffer greatly. So let's look at Nigeria. We're going to look at all three of these countries individually. So in Nigeria, they are the largest oil producer in all of Africa. They are a member of the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, which means they are a major exporter of oil. And they have goals to maximize these profits and also make these markets very stable. So we limit these kinds of extreme fluctuations. Most resources are extracted in the southern Niger River Delta. However, there's also massive corruption as money is mostly squandered, and it's not getting to the people. It has weakened the incentive for political leaders to implement reforms that could promote broader economic development and governance. The sharp decline in oil prices in 2014 and 2016, if you look back at that graph, it's actually shown there. And it led to significant economic downturn in the country. And this had recession, high inflation, and currency depreciation, which means their currency wasn't worth as much. Multinational energy companies such as Shell have controlled the industry and influenced dramatically within the country. So Shell in the 90s has invested heavily in oil and infrastructure operations in Nigeria. Let's look at Iran. So resources are controlled by the theocracy, as you would expect. Competition for control over oil revenues has fueled corruption, patronage networks, and inefficiency within the government bureaucracy. In 2019, oil exports accounted for 70% of their total exports and roughly 30% of its GDP. We actually see here on this graph that their primary energy consumption is from natural gas, 31% through petroleum. Corruption scandals involve high-ranking officials and business tycoons, as well as other close ties with the government. And this highlights the competition for access to oil revenues to fuel more corruption and lucrative government contracts. The lack of transparency in the management of oil revenues has fueled public distrust, which means that government legitimacy and accountability is lowered. And this has also contributed to widespread corruption. All right, let's look at Russia. Major producer in oil, major producer in oil, coal, and natural gas, which is 60% of their total export revenues. Concentration in the economic power is in the state-owned energy companies. Yes, there's some private ones, but the state owns most of it, such as Gazprom or Rosneft, and they have very close ties to the government. This has facilitated rent extraction and corruption with allegations of cronyism or nepotism in the awarding of lucrative contracts and licenses. The ability to distribute resource rents allows the government to co-opt and reward loyal supporters, while also providing resources to address social and economic grievances. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, let me explain a little bit. So, the government in Russia, since most of the oil, coal, and natural gas is in the hands of state-owned energy companies, they are the ones who are able to distribute them and distribute the resource rents. So the government rewards those who is loyal to them and who are in the government's favor. And if they want to, they can also distribute resources to fit social and economic needs. But if they feel like they shouldn't, they won't. Or if they don't want to, they won't. They have control over the provisioning. So the concentration of economic power as a result will limit competition and innovation in the energy sector. There's obviously heavy corruption that's tied to Putin and United Russia. And there we go. We have finished the course. You are done. Good job. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you haven't checked out the other lectures, go watch those. They're not as long as this one, I think. This is probably the longest one. But certainly go check those out. They're very adept, very exciting stuff. We've gone through a ton of different concepts related to these course countries, and I'm proud of you for making it this far. If you made it this far, let me know in the comments down below. There are practice tests in the description, key terms. If you have any AP Comparative Government questions, please leave a comment. You can message me on Discord. Do whatever you need to. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe, like the video. It really does help me out. I'll see you guys in the next one. Adios.